The ragged coastline of the smoking sea stretched out under a sky of ash and ruddy sunlight, a cruel and haunted land that had once been a glorious empire. In ancient days, tall spires of fused stone and halls of gleaming marble rose above the horizon, their walls alive with artistry and sorcery alike. But all of that grandeur had been swallowed in the doom, a cataclysm so complete that even the mightiest illusions of power melted into the molten earth. Tales of old Valyria had passed into legend, a whispered memory carried by exiles and dreamers, a cautionary tale about the hunger of ambition and the peril of hubris. For centuries, fishermen who ventured too close to the smoking sea claimed to hear the low groan of dragons beneath the waves, or see flickering shapes in the mists. Yet no one truly believed that any trace of old Valyria had survived in those cursed waters. It was a realm where ghosts and horrors reigned, not men, certainly not Dragonriders. Yet in the last 2 years, rumors of something impossible had begun to drift across the seas. Sailors swore they spied the silhouettes of towering structures through the vapors, spires that burned with pale fire. Others spoke of black-winged shapes that soared overhead, vanishing into the sullen clouds. A dread curiosity caught hold of the world. Some said the spirits of the Valyrian freehold stirred again. Others whispered that dark sorcery had reawakened. A few cautious souls, men and women of knowledge, wondered if perhaps the land itself had defied the doom. In Bravos, in Volantis, in Pentos, in Lys, even as far west as King's Landing, the question spread like a fever dream. Across the narrow sea, in the halls of King's Landing, Queen Rhaella Targaryen, young, determined, and keen-eyed, found herself facing a council divided on how to respond to the rumor. Some insisted it was a trick, perhaps the work of pirates or warlocks. Others pleaded that the very idea of Valyria's rebirth was a sign of ill omens. But Rhaella, descendant of the blood of the dragon, could not resist the pull of that ancient home. She remembered the lessons of her grandsire, stories told of the lost empire from which House Targaryen had fled just before the doom. To her, the slightest possibility that Valyria had returned was too significant to ignore. After all, if there were living Dragonriders there, or the means to breed new dragons, she had to know. For the sake of the realm, for the sake of her lineage, for the sake of the balance of power, she would sail east. And so the royal fleet departed Dragonstone in secret touch. The queen was joined by a retinue of knights, scholars, and her loyal Kingsguard. Word of the expedition leaked out as all secrets do, but the realm was too occupied by its own intrigues to mount any protest. The voyage to Valyria's dreaded ruins took weeks, with the smoking seas, roiling currents, and noxious air making every day a trial. Men whispered prayers to every god they knew. Lanterns glowed pale in the unnatural fog. Screams of birds with razor talons echoed off the ragged cliffs. Strange green fires danced on the horizon at night, sometimes coiling and reflecting on the sea's black surface. Each day wore on the expedition's courage, wearing them down with the oppressive sense of doom that lingered in the air, a suffocating heaviness that weighed upon hearts and minds. On the final approach, their flagship glided through still waters, thick with the stench of brimstone. A hush fell over the deck. No one spoke, for the horizon had revealed an unspeakable sight. Tall silhouettes rose from a coast that was supposed to be a wasteland of stone and ruin. Amid the half-collapsed remains of ancient city walls, new towers of black stone gleamed under the haze. Dim torchlight flickered along high battlements. A monstrous, serrated gate of fused metal and dragonbone stood open, leading inland to structures half ancient and half new. The architecture was unmistakable. Swooping, elegant lines reminiscent of the great freehold style, though hammered and twisted by something else, as though the land itself had shaped it to its will. Even the black stone looked like it had grown, almost organic, some terrible melding of sorcery and basalt. Smoke and red ash spiraled around those spires, rising from beneath the ground, as though the earth still roiled with the unquiet ghosts of the Valyrian Peninsula. The crew looked on in disbelief. Some fell to their knees in fear, certain they had arrived at the gates of the underworld. Others found their hands shaking with some inchoate excitement, a primal stir that came from being close to such forbidden majesty. Queen Rhaella's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face calm, forcing herself to appear confident. She had read so many accounts of old Valyria. Nothing in them quite matched what she saw now. This was beauty and terror entwined. The spires seemed lit by an inner glow, as though serpents of flame dwelled within the stone. And then there came the shape that confirmed the impossible truth. High above, blocking out the pale sun, a dragon soared. Its hide was the color of fresh-cooled obsidian, its wings broad as a galley's sails. It roared a thunderous greeting that turned the sailors' blood cold. When that roar echoed against the twisted mountains, 4 more dragons emerged, each a different color. Silver, copper, black streaked red, pale gold, and they circled like watchers around the prow of the Targaryen flagship. No one dared draw a bow. Queen Rhaella stood at the rail, the wind whipping her silver hair, and she realized tears were coursing down her face. She, who had never seen a living dragon except in faded Targaryen tapestries, was now surrounded by them. She could feel it in her blood, a shock of recognition, as though the ancient magic that once thrummed in Valyria's halls still survived. Perhaps it had slept in her heritage, waiting for this moment. Perhaps it was only fear. Yet, she could not deny the raw power in the air. The dragons roared again, and the gate to that half-ruined, half-reborn city seemed to beckon. She ordered a landing party. Despite the pleas of her advisors, she insisted on going ashore herself. A hush settled over her people as the small boats were lowered. The dragons continued circling overhead, enormous shadows weaving between columns of ash. Knights drew swords but did not brandish them. They simply held steel in trembling fists, aware that such weapons would be hopeless against such beasts. Queen Rhaella had donned armor in the Targaryen colors, black and red, and a modest crown that shimmered with rubies. She stepped from the boat onto Valyrian soil with a reverence seldom displayed by monarchs outside their own capitals. The ground crackled underfoot, layered with volcanic glass. The air was hot, thick with a taste of sulfur. Ahead, half shrouded by swirling fumes, stood a group of robed figures, each accompanied by a dragon. They wore cloaks of gray and black, embroidered with threads that seemed to shift color in the light. At their throats, each had a clasp shaped like a dragon's head. Their faces were pale, some with the classic Valyrian features, silver gold hair, amethyst eyes, high cheekbones, while others looked more diverse, as though the bloodlines had expanded. The one in the center was a tall woman with hair as white as snow, unbound and flowing to her waist. A gold torque shaped like a dragon encircled her neck. Her dragon, the largest of the group, crouched behind her with its wings partially folded, smoke trailing from its nostrils. The woman lifted a hand in greeting, speaking in a voice that carried like a cathedral's echo. But the language was unfamiliar. It sounded like High Valyrian, but older, deeper, a resonance that caught in the ear like ancient song. The robed figures around her looked expectantly at Queen Rhaella and her party, waiting to see if they understood. The Queen's maester stepped forward, gathering his courage. He was a scholar of old tongues, though he had never heard this exact dialect. Tentatively, he offered a greeting in classical High Valyrian. It made the tall woman smile, her expression glowing with a kind of welcoming delight. She responded in words close enough to the classical form that the maester could grasp the meaning. "We have waited long," she said, or so the maester translated. "We have felt the presence of our distant kin. You are Targaryen, are you not?" Rhaella bowed, placing a hand over her heart. She spoke the words in her best High Valyrian, naming herself the rightful queen of the 7 kingdoms, last scion of the dragon lords who had escaped the doom centuries past. It was a moment that felt like a dream, to stand on Valyrian soil, addressing those who called themselves the inheritors of the old empire. For all her poise, Rhaella's voice quavered. She glanced at the dragons around them, fear and wonder dancing in her eyes. She had come expecting ruins, perhaps monstrous beasts or vengeful spirits, if the stories were true. To find an entire community of people, Dragonriders, living in some restored version of the ancient city was beyond belief. The tall woman introduced herself as Nyriz Valar, though the maester needed a moment to parse her name. She spoke slowly, carefully, explaining that she and her kin were the keepers of this reborn Valyria. Their ancestors had survived the doom by retreating into hidden sanctuaries deep beneath the volcanic mountains, places shaped by arcane arts that even the old freehold had considered dangerous. For centuries, they had lived in darkness and secrecy, forging a bond with the surviving dragons that likewise fled into those fiery caverns. Recent shifts in the earth, perhaps set in motion by new magic or cosmic alignment, had forced them to the surface again. In truth, they had been planning their return for decades, waiting for the right signs in the sky, the right portents in the flames. And now that the surface was less hostile, they had begun rebuilding their capital, harnessing the power of the volcanic flows that once ruined them. She gestured to the renewed towers. Even with the dust of centuries clinging to them, even with sections still crumbled and melted, they stood proud. Ancient wards, half lost to time, had been rekindled. Dragons nested in the vaults and roosts that once housed them in the Age of Empire. The forging of a new Valyrian freehold had begun. Nerys described it as a haven for Dragonriders, an echo of the old glory, but free from the sin of Empire's cruelty. A place where knowledge, not conquest, was paramount. She admitted that they did not have the population nor the inclination to dominate the world as the freehold had. They had seen what ambition had wrought upon the land. They wanted a refuge, a sanctuary, for those of Valyrian blood and for others who wished to share in the knowledge of dragons, so long as they came in peace. As Queen Rhaella listened, her astonishment deepened. She recalled tales of Valyria's arrogance, their thousands of dragons, their dominion over Essos. She wondered if these people truly were different. Yet the presence of even a handful of living dragons changed everything. The Targaryen line had all but lost its ability to hatch new dragons. The last had died decades before. Now, if these Dragonriders sought only knowledge and refuge, what did that imply for the balance of power across the world? Her mind swam with questions. How had they survived? How did they breed their dragons? How did they preserve their arcane arts when all was supposedly destroyed? You must come with us, Nerys Valyria said, turning gracefully as she guided the queen and her retinue through the gargantuan gates. Her watchers parted, revealing a thoroughfare of cracked and melted stone lined with statues that had been half reshaped by heat. Some looked newly chiseled. Others lay toppled and broken. Yet there was order amid the ruin. Fresh banners of black and gray with the symbol of a dragon's skull stretched across pillars. Torches burned bright with chemical flames that glowed white and purple. The smell of sulfur was everywhere, but so was a sense of reverence. The temperature increased as they went deeper into the city, passing open fissures in the ground that glowed with molten rock. Rhaella's knights sweated in their armor, and the horses, already skittish, nearly refused to proceed. But they pressed on, driven by wonder. Nerys led them to a wide courtyard surrounded by columns of fused black stone. A mosaic sprawled across the ground, depicting scenes from Valyria's fabled history. Dragons in flight, mountains spewing flame, robed figures binding the creatures in a ring of magic. Much of the mosaic was damaged, but enough survived to hint at the lost empire's grandeur. Servants, some evidently not of Valyrian blood, brought pitchers of water and bowls of strange fruit. The knights hesitated to eat or drink, but Rhaella, desperate to show trust, took a careful sip. Surprisingly, the water was cool, sweeter than she expected. She nodded for her retinue to do the same, then followed Nerys up a curved set of stairs that led into a tall keep of obsidian and fused marble. Inside, the air shimmered with heat, and the walls glowed faintly from rivulets of magma that flowed beneath glass-like floors. Enormous braziers shaped like dragon skulls lined the hall, pouring forth fragrant smoke. The hall opened into a throne room of sorts, though it was not the typical seat of a king or queen. Instead, there were half a dozen raised platforms, each with a draconic motif. On them sat elders, men and women whose hair ran the entire spectrum from silver white to black shot through with streaks of gold. Their eyes were of unnatural hues, amethyst, silver, onyx, jade, or deep crimson. They wore simple robes, but each had a staff or scepter crowned with a sculpted dragon's head. They regarded Rhaella and her party intently, as though weighing their worth. Nerys bowed before the elders, introducing them as the keepers of the new flame, the council that guided reborn Valyria. She explained that these keepers represented different bloodlines and arcane disciplines. One specialized in healing, another in the forging of Valyrian steel, another in the old rites of prophecy, another in the direct care and breeding of dragons. They had each inherited knowledge passed down in secret. And they all knew of the Targaryen line, the one that escaped the doom and carved out a kingdom in Westeros. The old records told of Aenar Targaryen who fled the peninsula with his family and 5 dragons, guided by the prophetic dream of his daughter, Daenerys the Dreamer. The keepers regarded the Targaryens as distant cousins, a seed of Valyria that had taken root in foreign soil. Their expressions seemed curious rather than hostile, but a certain tension thrummed in the air. Would these Targaryens claim dominion, or would they embrace the new Valyria's ideals? In careful High Valyrian, Rhaella explained that she came seeking truth. She wished to know how such a miracle could occur. She had not come to conquer, but to witness. Any alliance would have to respect the sovereignty of the 7 kingdoms, and likewise, the keepers' independence. She was open to forging ties of knowledge, trade, and mutual defense, perhaps even bridging their peoples after centuries apart. The council listened, their expressions inscrutable. They asked about Westeros, about how the Targaryens had ruled, about the state of the dragons there, none living, she admitted sadly. They asked if the Targaryens still upheld the old traditions. Rhaella did not lie. She said that the faith of the 7 had shaped her people now. Polygamy and blood magic were no longer practiced, if indeed they ever had been. They were a different people, but they still carried the blood of old Valyria, still lit their hearths with a spark of the draconic flame. At that, one of the keepers, an elder named Valon, gave a long sigh. "We do not mourn the ancient ways that were cruel," he said gently, his accent thick but understandable. "We do not seek to replicate the darkest shadows of the Empire. But knowledge is knowledge, and power is power. We do not shy away from it. We see it as a burden to be harnessed responsibly. We were taught by our forebears that the dragons chose us not for tyranny, but for partnership. The Empire forgot that truth, and so it fell." "No." Another keeper, an old woman with black hair shot through with white, leaned forward. "The question remains, why have you come now, Targaryen Queen? Did you dream of us, or did chance guide you here?" Rhaella admitted it was mere rumor at first, then curiosity. Yet if she were truly honest, it was more than that. She had felt a stirring in her blood for weeks before the expedition sailed, a restlessness that haunted her dreams. She saw images of spires and dragons half submerged in molten rock, reaching out to her. It was as though Valyria was calling her, bridging the centuries that separated them. At these words, an almost collective breath rippled through the keepers. Their dragons, perched on ledges overhead, rumbled in uncanny unison. Something unspoken passed among them. At last, the eldest keeper spoke, a thin man with a voice like wind over volcanic vents. "Then, perhaps we have been waiting for you too." The old prophecies did not end with Daenerys the Dreamer. There were lines and verses that spoke of a time when Valyria would rise anew, purged of its worst sins, guided by a returning bloodkin from across the seas. We have debated the meaning of these lines for generations, but if you have dreamt of us, it may be that the dragons themselves call you. Rhaella bowed her head, unsure whether to be awed or terrified. She had never considered herself a prophet or dreamer. Her father, her ancestors, they had not displayed the gift of dragon dreams. Yet something had led her here, and clearly these newly revealed Valyrians believed it as more than coincidence. Then she remembered something, the Targaryen tradition that sometimes certain members of the family would have prophetic dreams. Daenerys, Aegon the Conqueror, and others. Could it be that she too possessed a glimmer of that gift, awakened only by the presence of this re-emergent power? In the days that followed, Rhaella's party was given leave to explore this new Valyria under escort. They saw how the dwellings were carved out of the old ruins, how the people lived in a tenuous harmony with the volatile terrain. There were small but thriving enclaves of craftsmen who forged weapons and tools from newly forged Valyrian steel, adding to the mythic metal's legend. Gardens were cultivated in pockets of the city fed by hot springs. Livestock was kept, albeit in smaller numbers. The population was not large, perhaps a few thousand souls, but they possessed knowledge that felt centuries ahead of anything in Westeros, or even in Essos. Arcane glyphs chiseled into certain walls helped protect living quarters from toxic fumes. Canal-like structures directed lava flows to create natural forges or to warm water for steam baths. Everything carried an undercurrent of magic, a synergy of the arcane and the practical, but the dragons were the heart of it. Hundreds of them roosted on ledges carved into the mountainside or in the basalt cathedrals that spanned the city's perimeter. Many were still young, barely large enough to carry a slender rider. Yet some were ancient, massive creatures with wings that blocked out the sun. Raela's retinue walked cautiously through wide plazas where dragons sprawled, devouring herds of goats with wet tearing sounds. Their roars shook the ground, their eyes gleamed with uncanny intelligence. The Targaryen knights trained in the legends of their house could scarcely restrain their tears at the sight. For so long, House Targaryen had imagined the dragons gone from the world, just like the fabled homeland. Now both were alive before their eyes. One evening, Valyria led the queen to a high parapet overlooking the smoking sea. The sun bled red in the sky, and the mists over the water shimmered with unnatural hues. Dragons circled in the distance, calling to one another in resonant tones. Naerys gestured for Raela to stand beside her at the edge, then spoke quietly. "This is the vantage point from which I first saw your sails. We have watchers stationed along the coast. We protect ourselves from intruders who might wish to exploit or destroy us. When we realized a Targaryen fleet was approaching, we prepared to greet you with caution and hope. We are relieved that your intentions are not hostile. But your realm is vast and full of ambitions, or so the stories say. Will they allow a new Valyria to exist in peace?" I'll call. Raela considered the question. She admitted that not all would welcome a resurgence of Valyrian power. Certainly, the free cities, Volantis especially, might fear a reawakened empire that once dominated Essos. The Iron Throne might also worry about a rival power. Yet she promised to do what she could to ensure that knowledge and trade bound them together, not war. She confessed that the presence of dragons alone might change the tides of power in her homeland. Many might be tempted to claim them, or to challenge Valyria. Naerys only nodded in recognition. Power invites conflict. That is the lesson of history. But we are not the old freehold. Our numbers are too small for empire, and our hearts do not desire conquest. They stood in pensive silence. Then Naerys turned, her amethyst eyes glowing in the dusk. "There is something we wish to offer you, Raela Targaryen. A chance to form a lasting bond with a hatchling. If your blood calls to them, it may be possible for you to become a Dragonrider. This is how our heritage endures. The bond is sacred, demanding mutual respect. Will you accept?" "Delcoily." The queen's breath caught. Her entire body trembled with longing and fear. To bond with a dragon was the ancient dream of every Targaryen, a birthright lost generations ago. The thought that she, in her lifetime, might ride a dragon filled her with near disbelief. Yet she hesitated. She recalled how dragons had burned entire armies in Westeros, how the Targaryens once subdued an entire continent with fire and blood. Was she ready to harness such power? What would it demand of her? What would it make her? I would be honored," she said, her voice trembling. Naerys nodded solemnly. "Then, at dawn, we go to the hatchery. Prepare your heart. The bond can be dangerous if the dragon does not accept you." That night, Raela barely slept. She sensed the land itself pulsing beneath her, as though molten rivers coursed not only through the ground but through her veins. Her dreams were of fire and flight, of a black dragon's eye staring into her soul, testing, judging. When dawn finally arrived, she donned a simple tunic and breeches, clothes more suited to a traveler than a queen. Accompanied by Naerys, her maester, and two of her most loyal king's guard, she made her way to the hatchery. It was a cavernous chamber carved into the side of a rocky hill, with vents in the ceiling allowing flows of hot air. The walls were lined with shelves of obsidian crates, each containing an egg. Some eggs were the size of a large melon, others bigger than a man's head. A subtle glow emanated from them, as if each shell contained a living flame. The heat was intense, sweat gathering along Raela's brow in seconds. 4 keepers stood guard over the hatchery, each cradling small dragons. The creatures hissed and clicked in greeting. One older keeper named Maldoron gently guided Raela to a low platform where 6 eggs lay in a bed of smoldering coals. She sensed the presence of ancient magic, an energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Maldoron explained that these eggs were near hatching, and that if the newborns accepted her scent and presence, one might bond with her. But if not, they could be aggressive or simply withdraw, refusing any connection. As they waited, The thick shells began to crack with subtle pops. The first egg, shimmering bronze and gold, hatched with surprising speed. A dragonling no larger than a cat crawled out with awkward limbs. Its eyes blinked, and it squeaked softly, a puff of smoke escaping its tiny jaws. Rayella's heart thundered. She stepped forward cautiously, arms outstretched to show she bore no weapon. The hatchling tottered toward her, sniffing. She could feel the scorching heat radiating from its body. Its scales still glistened with embryonic fluid. When she lowered a hand, it pressed its snout against her palm, testing her. A wave of dizziness overcame her, a sense of something unfathomably ancient opening its eyes inside her mind. Then, in a flash, the hatchling recoiled, hissing. It scurried away, nestling behind a rock, leaving her slightly heartbroken. The second egg cracked open, revealing a dragon with deep purple scales, flecked with silver. It made a high-pitched crooning sound. Once again, Rayella approached slowly, letting the dragonling sniff. This one was bolder, taking a step onto her foot, its tiny claws gripping the leather of her boot. She felt a strange flutter in her chest, as if the hatchling's heartbeat were echoing in her own. For a moment, it seemed to accept her, nuzzling against her wrist. She found herself smiling through tears. Then the hatchling backed away, gazed up at her, and let out an unhappy screech. Its eyes narrowed. Something about her scent, or her energy, or some intangible mismatch made it uncertain. With a low hiss, it darted off, scratching at the stone floor. 2 more eggs hatched. Each time, Rayella tried to make contact. Each time, the bond failed. She felt each rejection like a small heartbreak, as though she were reaching out for some cosmic connection that refused to link. The keepers looked on with empathy. One of them murmured that not every candidate succeeded on the first attempt, or even at all. Even Targaryens with draconic blood might fail if the hatchlings did not sense the right resonance. Rayella felt tears burn behind her eyes. Had she come all this way, felt this calling, only to be spurned? Then came the 6th egg, a dark shell with swirling streaks of red, like embers in charred wood. Its hatching was slow, each crack labored. When at last the shell split fully, a dragonling emerged that was smaller than the others. Its scales were black with faint maroon highlights, and its eyes glowed a molten gold. It made no sound at first, only blinked at the brightness of the chamber. Rayella approached gently, every part of her trembling. She extended her hand again, her breath caught in her throat. The hatchling wobbled on unsteady legs, took a few tentative steps, then sniffed her fingers. Its eyes narrowed thoughtfully, as though it were taking in her entire being. A moment later, it snorted a little burst of flame that singed the tips of her hair. She gasped but held steady. For a lingering heartbeat, nothing happened. Then she felt it, a surge of warmth, not just physical but something that coursed from her core to the dragons. It made her thoughts swirl, her heart race. The hatchling let out a tiny squeak, pressing its head against her palm. Suddenly, a wave of emotion and imagery flooded her mind, an impression of flight, of hot wind, of ancient shadows dancing in flame. She gasped, nearly collapsing. The hatchling extended its little wings, shading her from the glow of the braziers. And in that moment, she knew it had chosen her. Tears slid down Rayella's cheeks as she gently cradled the small creature, feeling it nuzzle against her chest, seeking the comforting sound of her heartbeat. A rumble of approval echoed from the adult dragons perched outside. The keepers bowed in respect. Even Nariz looked genuinely moved. "The bond is made," Malderon said solemnly, placing a hand over his heart. "May it bring wisdom and not woe." Rayella could hardly speak. She held the warm, wriggling form of her new dragon, her mind ablaze with the enormity of the moment. She felt both terrified and exalted. Every story of Targaryen lore, every tapestry and scroll had led to this, a living bond with a creature of magic and might. For the first time in centuries, a Targaryen monarch had become a true Dragonrider. In the following days, she spent every moment learning how to care for her hatchling. She discovered its temperament, curious, easily startled by loud noises, fiercely protective once it recognized her as kin. She named it Korhagon, after an ancient Valyrian word for ember in the dark. The name felt fitting for its smoldering scales and flickering, ember-like eyes. The keepers guided her in the basics of feeding, grooming, and forging a mental link. They explained that as the dragon grew, their bond would deepen, enabling them to share glimpses of each other's senses. To fly together, though, was still years away. Dragons needed time to mature, to gain strength and size enough to bear a rider. But already Raella noticed a profound shift within herself. She dreamed vividly of swirling skies and molten caverns. She found herself humming old Valyrian lullabies she had never consciously learned. Something in Corrigan's presence awakened parts of her soul long buried. The knights and advisors who accompanied her were awestruck. They spoke of how this development would reshape the Seven Kingdoms, how it might strengthen Raella's claim and unify her power. Yet she was not so sure. Perhaps it would sow fear instead. Perhaps it would provoke challengers. Could her dream of forging a peaceful alliance with the new Valyria hold, or would it breed new conflicts? One evening, as she stood in the city's highest tower with Corrigan perched on a windowsill, Naeris found her. The older woman's eyes were soft with compassion. "You have taken your first steps into our ancient world," she said gently, standing beside Raella as they gazed across the smoldering horizon. "I sense your doubts. The old empire was built on conquest, but we are a different generation. And you, Raella Targaryen, are different as well. Will you stand with us forging a haven for Dragonriders, or will you return home to rule with an iron fist?" Nay. Raella considered the question carefully. "I do not seek war. I seek a future where knowledge and prosperity flow between Valyria and Westeros, between all lands. Is that naive? Perhaps. But if we do not try, the cycle of bloodshed repeats." Naeris touched her arm in solidarity. "I, too, believe we can be better than our ancestors. But the world will not yield easily. Many will see dragons and old sorceries as a threat." Raella nodded. "Then we must show them it need not be. Let our first alliance be an exchange of knowledge. Let us open a path for envoys and students to learn from you, and for you to learn from them. My realm will not fully trust you until they see your intentions. And you, likewise, must see the Seven Kingdoms for yourselves." Nain. So it was arranged. When Raella and her party returned to Westeros, a handful of Valyrians accompanied them, emissaries from the Keepers, along with a few younger Dragonriders who would remain discreet, stabling their dragons on Dragonstone rather than risking panic in King's Landing. In return, the Keepers welcomed a small group of maesters and scholars, along with blacksmiths eager to learn the secret of Valyrian steel. Though the Keepers guarded their deepest secrets carefully, it was a delicate, tentative step. Many in both lands remained suspicious, fearful of awakening the ghosts of the old empire. Yet curiosity and hope prevailed. In King's Landing, the reaction to the Queen's success was seismic. The sight of a newborn dragon in her arms, transported in a special heated container, sparked a frenzy at court. Some lords pledged renewed fealty, seeing the re-emergence of Targaryen power as a chance to re-establish fear in the monarchy. Others worried that this would invite yet another Targaryen civil war, with pretenders and rebels seeking to control or slay the Queen's dragon. The faith was unsure how to respond, torn between reverence for their sovereign and dread of what dragonfire could mean. Even small folk told wild tales of the Queen taming a devil beast from the smoking sea. Through it all, Raella remained steadfast. She established a new advisory council dedicated to matters concerning dragons, magic, and foreign relations with Valyria. She petitioned the High Septon for guidance on integrating this old tradition into the realm's existing faith. She hosted the Valyrian emissaries in a newly refurbished wing of the Red Keep, ensuring they had privacy and the heat they preferred. On Dragonstone, the young Valyrian Dragonriders became a point of fascination for Westerosi knights, who had only read about such warriors in old epics. Duels of honor and martial demonstrations became common, forging grudging respect between the two groups. Some tensions flared, especially when Westerosi knights saw the power of even a small adult dragon. But the novelty of real dragon riders at court overshadowed much of the unease, for a time. Back in reborn Valyria, the Keepers continued their slow work of rebuilding. The population was small, but they welcomed outsiders who wished to join their ranks, men and women who demonstrated a sincere desire to learn the old ways and maintain the city's neutrality. A trickle of Associ travelers came from Volantis, Lais, and other free cities, drawn by the promise of lost secrets. Some brought trade goods, others their own arcane knowledge. The keepers were selective, requiring oaths to respect their laws. In return, they offered a safe haven. Gradually, the city grew in population. Markets appeared along ancient thoroughfares. Smiths began forging steel weapons with minor infusions of Valyrian techniques, though the full forging of Valyrian steel itself remained a closely guarded skill. The dragons roosted in newly carved ledges on the city's periphery, riding out occasionally to survey the region or fish in deeper waters. The land remained dangerous. Pockets of volcanic instability, mutated creatures, and leftover curses from the doom lurked. But the keepers expanded their wards, cleansing the area bit by bit. For a while, it seemed as though peace might hold. Tales reached Westeros of a new city rising among the ashes, a sanctuary for Dragonriders, mages, and scholars. Merchants smelled profit. Nobles speculated on alliances. The Seven Kingdoms were rife with talk of a second Valyrian renaissance, this time perhaps kinder and wiser. Yet wariness coiled in the hearts of many. The rumors of shadow binding, blood sorcery, and the forging of living steel still haunted men's nightmares. And beyond political concerns, there were deeper forces at play, ancient powers that had stirred with Valyria's return. Queen Rhaella learned of these threats through her deepening bond with Corrigan. As her dragon grew, so did her dreams. She began to see flashes of darkness creeping through the volcanic tunnels under the city. She sensed a malevolent presence that watched the newly risen Valyrians with ancient malice. Sometimes, in the dream, she saw monstrous shapes twisting in the flames, bestial but cunning. She confided in Naris, who confirmed that old evils, once sealed beneath the 14 flames, might have awakened when their wards were broken. The keepers knew of such dangers, but their numbers were limited. Could they defend reborn Valyria from the horrors that had destroyed the Empire the first time? A decision was reached between Rhaella and the keepers to combine their efforts. As part of a new pact, they formed a vigilant order, Dragonriders from both Targaryen heritage and the keepers' lines, dedicated to guarding against threats arising from the Smoking Sea. It was a small band at first. Rhaella herself could not yet ride Corrigan, for he was still too young. But a handful of Valyrian riders with older dragons volunteered. From Westeros, a few knights offered to train as scribes and outriders, though they lacked the ability to bond with dragons. Their vow was to uphold the sanctity of reborn Valyria and protect the borders of the Smoking Sea from dark sorceries or opportunistic raiders. They became known informally as the Order of the Embers, referencing the idea that they were the glowing embers of a once mighty flame, waiting to ignite into new fire if necessary. Their vigilance soon proved necessary. Strange ships began appearing off the coasts, laden with sellswords and would-be treasure hunters. At first, they were easily turned away by the sight of circling dragons. But as the months passed, more formidable forces arrived, rumored to be financed by powerful magisters in the free cities who feared or envied Valyria's resurgence. Skirmishes broke out at sea. The narrow passes leading into Valyria were ambushed by cunning pirate fleets. The Order of the Embers took flight, raining dragonfire upon the aggressors. The battles were brief and brutal, leaving smoking hulks in the water. Word spread quickly. To assault New Valyria was to court fiery annihilation. But not all foes came from without. Reports of mysterious vanishings in the city's outskirts alarmed the keepers. People disappeared near certain collapsed temples that led into deeper tunnels. Some claimed to hear inhuman howls echoing from below. The young Valyrian watchers who ventured into those tunnels sometimes returned badly wounded, reporting sightings of twisted creatures, scaled abominations that crawled through the darkness, half dead, possibly mutated by leftover sorcery from the Doom. Rumors flew of a hidden cult that sought to resurrect the darkest Valyrian rites, fueling arcane experiments with captive victims. The keepers could not confirm such rumors, but the evidence pointed to some organized menace. Over time, it became clear that reborn Valyria was threatened from both within and without. Word of these growing troubles reached Westeros. Queen Rhaella faced pressure from her council. Some urged her to distance the realm from Valyria's chaos. Others argued that a show of solidarity would strengthen the Targaryen hold on the region. Rhaella, remembering her vow to support this new haven for Dragonriders, decided to send aid. She dispatched a detachment of knights and engineers to help fortify the city's perimeter. Among them was Sir Gerd Waters, an ambitious young knight rumored to be the queen's bastard half-brother, who burned with desire to see a new age of dragons. Rayella hoped that these knights would bolster the Order of the Embers, forging a deeper bond of cooperation and ensuring that no hidden cult or outside threat could easily topple the fragile new settlement. When Sir Gaird's forces arrived, they marveled at the city's progress. Where once stood half-collapsed ruins, they found watchtowers bristling with scorpions and ballistae. Dragon perches dotted the walls, each one manned by a keeper with a signal horn. The knights drilled with Valyrian swordsmen, learning each other's methods. Gaird, awestruck by the dragons, sought an audience with the keepers to see if he might bond with a hatchling. But though he had distant Targaryen blood, it was deemed too diluted. The hatchlings hissed at him, one nearly searing off his eyebrows. Humiliated, he nursed resentment, but he remained loyal to the queen's directive, channeling his energies into the city's defense. He struck up an uneasy friendship with a Valyrian rider named Lysara, whose pale green dragon was a seasoned flyer. Meanwhile, the disappearances continued. Gaird, Lysara, and a small band decided to explore the deeper tunnels beneath the city. They carried torches that sputtered in the sulphurous air, picking their way through old catacombs carved with runes. The deeper they went, the more they encountered half-collapsed passageways and subterranean caverns lined with black glass. The ground trembled occasionally, as if the mountains themselves were restless. Finally, they stumbled upon an ancient crypt sealed with a massive stone slab. Strange symbols, draconic heads entwined with serpentine bodies, were etched into the surface. A faint chanting echoed from behind it. With great effort, they pushed the slab aside. The chamber beyond was lit by eerie green flames. Hooded figures surrounded a carved altar, where a terrified captive struggled against restraints. The chanting figures wore masks shaped like twisted dragons, their cloaks dripping with some viscous substance. When they caught sight of the intruders, they let out feral hisses, brandishing wicked blades of dark metal. A sudden roar echoed through the space. A monstrous, half-formed creature lunged out of the shadows, scaled and spined, with eyes that glowed red. It resembled a dragon hybrid, but twisted, incomplete, like a flesh golem wrought by forbidden sorcery. The ensuing battle was frantic. Gaird led the charge, his sword clashing with the cultists' blades. Lysara channeled a flicker of arcane skill, conjuring a burst of flame from a small brazier to keep the monstrosity at bay. The cultists fought with insane fury, chanting in guttural Valyrian. One of them, evidently the leader, screeched that the true power of Valyria would arise from their right. Even as they fell, they uttered curses on the city above. The monstrous creature roared, batting knights aside, but Gaird managed a lucky strike with a Valyrian steel dagger, piercing its skull through the eye. It collapsed in a spasm of foul-smelling ichor. The surviving cultists fled deeper into the labyrinth. Gaird's group freed the captive, a half-dead blacksmith from Lys who had been lured to the city by promises of knowledge. Horrified by what they had witnessed, the band brought news back to the keepers. The cult's existence was now undeniable. They worshipped a twisted interpretation of dragon lore, seeking to harness vile transformations. Perhaps they were a remnant of the darkest Valyrian practices that had once dabbled in blood magic and shapeshifting. With new resolve, the keepers ordered a systematic purge of the tunnels. The knights from Westeros joined in the effort. Whenever the cult's lairs were found, a combined force of swords and dragons cleansed them with fire. Yet the cultists proved elusive, relocating through hidden passages, always vanishing before the final blow could be dealt. Still, each victory kept the city safer. As the months passed, Rayella's bond with Corrigan grew deeper. The hatchling was now a young drake, large enough to fly short distances without a rider. Rayella felt his emotions like an echo in her mind, his hunger, his curiosity, his moments of playful aggression. She could soothe him by humming certain notes, an instinct she did not fully understand but which seemed to come from ancient memory. The day soon arrived when Corrigan was deemed strong enough to bear her on a short flight, a moment that electrified the entire realm. People gathered on Dragonstone, on the battlements of the Red Keep, and throughout reborn Valyria to witness the event. At dawn, Rayella stood in the courtyard of Dragonstone's keep, outfitted in specially crafted leathers designed to protect her from dragonfire and harness her to Corrigan's saddle. Her heart hammered as she climbed onto the dragon's back. She felt the powerful muscles coil beneath her thighs, sensed the molten heat emanating through his scales. With a thunderous bellow, Corrigan spread his wings. She clung tight, every sense alive with anticipation and fear. Then, with a mighty downward thrust, they were airborne, surging up past the towers in a rush of wind and swirling ash from the city's forges. The crowd below erupted in cheers and gasps as the Targaryen queen and her dragon soared into the early morning sky. For Rhaella, the experience was transcendent. The updraft carried them higher, the wind whipping her hair back, the horizon unfurling like a painted tapestry. She glimpsed the glint of the narrow sea, the sprawl of King's Landing in the distance, the shadowy shape of reborn Valyria far beyond. Her heart pounded with an exhilaration she had never known. Corrigan roared, the sound echoing across the waves. She could almost taste the salt air mixing with the dragon's fiery breath. For a few precious moments, she was free from earthly cares. Then the reality of steering him set in. She recalled her training, small shifts in her body, vocal commands in Valyrian. They circled the island twice. Then Corrigan descended in a controlled glide, landing amid swirling dust and astonished knights. Rhaella dismounted, legs trembling, eyes shining with tears of joy. In that instant, the dream of a new Valyria, a new age of dragons, felt undeniably real. Yet as soon as Rhaella touched the ground, she felt a deep ache in her chest. A pang of dread, as though some invisible hand clutched her heart. She glanced at Corrigan, who let out a low rumble, shifting uneasily. Something was amiss. A messenger rushed forward, breathless, bearing news from the east. The cultists had launched a coordinated assault within reborn Valyria. Using sabotage and dark magic, they had collapsed part of the city's outer defenses, unleashing noxious gases that killed dozens. They had allied with foreign mercenaries, bypassing watchers by some cunning means. The keepers were under siege. Within the hour, Rhaella had mustered her knights, assembling a war fleet to sail for Valyria. She would not abandon the city that had welcomed her, taught her the old ways, and given her a dragon. She knew this might escalate into open war. So be it. If the cultists succeeded in overthrowing reborn Valyria, all the knowledge and promise of a kinder dragon lord civilization would be lost. Dark sorcery would rise in its place. The fleet departed before sunset, carrying as many men-at-arms as could be spared. Rhaella flew overhead on Corrigan, her presence a beacon of resolve. They arrived to find the coastline in chaos. Plumes of smoke rose from the half-rebuilt outer wards. Dragonriders loyal to the keepers strafed the invaders with fire, but ballistae had been set up on captured watchtowers, launching spears at the dragons. The cult's monstrous creations, grotesque hybrids of reptilian and human forms, prowled the city, attacking civilians and dragging them into subterranean lairs. Blood ran in the streets, and the sky was choked with ash. In the harbor, foreign ships under black sails traded catapult fire with Valyrian defenses. The ocean glowed with reflected flames, the air thunderous with war cries and dragon roars. Rhaella swooped low, guiding Corrigan in his first true battle. She felt his heart racing alongside hers. His flames were still young but potent enough to torch a war galley. She had to be careful, mindful of archers and ballista crews. Arrows whizzed by, one slicing a shallow cut across her arm. She clenched her jaw against the pain, focusing on the bond. With a sharp command, she unleashed Corrigan's fire upon a cluster of mercenaries preparing to storm the main gates. The flames ignited their siege engines, sending men scattering in terror. Cheers rose from the city's defenders. The clash lasted through a night of horror and fury. Dragon against abomination, steel against sorcery. The cultists invoked vile spells, temporarily shrouding entire blocks in illusions of black flame, luring defenders into ambush. But the keepers and their allied riders countered with wards laid down centuries ago. One by one, the twisted creatures fell to dragonfire or Valyrian steel. The mercenaries, disheartened by the cult's madness, began to break ranks. But the cult's leaders retreated into the largest temple, an immense structure perched on the edge of a volcanic fissure. There, they performed one last rite. The earth groaned, and a massive shape rose from the fissure, an elder worm, mutated beyond reason, a leftover from the doom itself. Its scales were sloughing off, revealing raw flesh that glowed with internal fire. It roared, shaking the city to its foundations, Dragons swarmed it, but it batted them aside with hideous strength. Its breath was a torrential blast of toxic flame. Tunnels collapsed, the ground buckled under the beast's weight. Raella and Corrigan joined the fray, diving from above. She felt the heat of its breath sear her face, narrowly dodging a fatal blast. The other Valyrian riders coordinated their assault, drawing the monstrosity's attention from multiple angles. Even so, it slowly advanced, smashing buildings, sending plumes of volcanic gas spewing into the air. At the height of the chaos, Nares Valar arrived on her ancient silver dragon, flanked by 3 other seasoned riders. Together, they unleashed a concentrated inferno, focusing their dragonfire on the worm's exposed flesh. The creature shrieked in unearthly agony, thrashing violently. Raella seized the opportunity, diving low to rake it with Corrigan's young flames. Then, in a final decisive strike, a Valyrian knight named Caurix plunged a massive Valyrian steel lance directly into the worm's skull. With a final roar, the beast collapsed, crashing into the fissure from which it emerged. Its fall triggered an eruption of molten rock, searing the remaining cultists who chanted around it. In a geyser of fire and magma, the temple was swallowed whole. When dawn broke over reborn Valyria, the city lay scarred but unbroken. Smoke hung heavy in the sky. Streets were clogged with rubble and bodies. Survivors stumbled through the ruins, searching for loved ones. The keepers and the allied knights worked tirelessly to rescue the injured. Dragons perched on the shattered walls, keening in mourning for the fallen. Yet amid the devastation, hope endured. The cult was vanquished, its leaders consumed by their own unholy creation. Foreign mercenaries either fled or surrendered. The city's defenders had stood united, Valyrians and Westerosi alike, forging a bond in blood and flame. Exhausted and covered in ash, Queen Raella dismounted Corrigan in the central plaza, where Nares waited with tears in her eyes. They embraced, the shared weight of victory and loss passing between them. Garrett Waters knelt at the queen's feet, battered but alive, pledging himself anew to her cause. Survivors from both lands bowed in respect, acknowledging that this day marked a turning point. The reborn haven for Dragonriders had faced its first great trial and prevailed. In the weeks that followed, they began rebuilding again, reinforced by new arrivals from Westeros who saw opportunity in forging ties with Valyria's formidable defenders. Maesters, healers, and builders poured in, establishing a functioning network of trade and knowledge exchange. The keepers recognized Raella as a true ally, offering her safe passage for her knights and scribes, and providing ongoing tutelage in the arcane arts that underpinned Valyria's very foundation. The city would never be what it once was, an empire spanning continents, nor did they wish it to be. Instead, it became a sanctuary of learning, a place where Dragonriders honed their skills not for conquest, but for protection against the real threats that lurked in the world's dark corners. Raella returned periodically to Westeros, mindful of her responsibilities as queen. Yet, her bond with Corrigan grew stronger with each visit to Valyria. In time, the young drake became large enough to bear her across entire seas in a single flight. She traveled back and forth, bridging the 2 worlds that fate had joined. Some lords in Westeros grumbled at the queen's growing fascination with Valyrian lore, concerned she might abandon them for a realm of sorcery. But she assured them that the Iron Throne remained her seat, her duty. Valyria was an ally, not a replacement for her native land. Over the years, a fragile but meaningful peace settled across the region. The old fear of dragons remained in some hearts, but the presence of a stable, cooperative Valyria, one content to defend its territory rather than expand, gradually eased tensions. Trade with Braavos and other free cities increased, though suspicion lingered. Ambassadors from across the known world came to see the wondrous city. Some offered gold to purchase dragons, only to be politely refused. The keepers insisted that dragons were not commodities. They bonded by ancient ritual and blood. No amount of gold could forge that link. Little by little, the nightmares of the Doom receded, overshadowed by the city's new alliances and achievements. The forges of reborn Valyria produced tools and weapons of incredible craftsmanship. The Order of the Embers patrolled the skies, guarding trade routes against pirates and monstrous threats. Universities of arcane and mundane studies thrived in the refurbished halls, merging Westerosi maester traditions with the old Valyrian lore. The young generation of riders grew up never knowing a time without their dragons, forging an ethic of responsibility into each new bond. Queen Raella's dream of a peaceful haven for dragon riders did not come without setbacks. Tensions rose when some Westerosi lords demanded a share of Valyrian steel, or tried to claim a role in the city's governance. Even among the keepers, debates flared about how open they should be to outsiders. Yet time and again, a commitment to mutual benefit prevailed. The memory of the cult's attack, the monstrous worm, and the savage mercenary invasions reinforced how fragile existence was on the Smoking Sea. Valyria needed allies as much as Westeros needed the city's knowledge. As the years stretched on, Raella became a legend in her own right, the queen who reforged Valyria, some called her, though she dismissed such grand titles. She saw herself not as a conqueror or messiah, but as a caretaker of an ancient legacy that belonged to more than just her house. She continued to rule the Seven Kingdoms with fairness, aided by a revitalized monarchy that no longer relied solely on fear, but drew strength from the possibilities of unity and exploration. Corrigan matured into a mighty dragon with dark, ember-flecked scales, known for a calm but fierce temperament. Their bond was among the strongest in living memory, a testament to what could be achieved by bridging old bloodlines and new ideals. In the final years of Raella's reign, reborn Valyria stood as a beacon, proof that the ruin of the Doom could be overcome by wisdom, unity, and respect for the dragons that once symbolized unbridled power. It was not a perfect utopia. Storms of ambition and external threats would always gather on the horizon. But it was a haven unlike any other, a testament that the old ways, tempered by compassion, could give rise to something that nurtured wonder and guarded hope against the shadows that lingered in the world. And though dragons soared once more over the Smoking Sea, their flames illuminating the ashen sky, they were no longer harbingers of tyranny, but guardians of a fragile peace. A peace that, for the first time in centuries, allowed both men and dragons to thrive, shoulder to shoulder, beneath the banner of a Valyria reborn. As the days of rebuilding turned to months and then years, the alliance between the Seven Kingdoms and reborn Valyria deepened in ways that neither realm had ever imagined. Despite lingering doubts in certain corners, Queen Raella's repeated voyages back to the Smoking Sea revealed tangible progress. Each time she arrived on Corrigan's back, now a young but fearsome dragon, sleek in his ember-touched black scales, she found more of the city cleared of rubble, more dwellings stabilized against the roiling heat beneath the ground. Streets bustled with artisans and scholars who had once been scattered throughout Essos, drawn by the promise that Valyria was no longer an unholy crater of doom, but a sanctuary for arcane pursuits. Mighty copper braziers lined the main avenues, burning with ghostly purple fire to lighten the sulphurous gloom. Fresh banners flew from half-repaired towers, signifying that the settlement accepted visitors and trade under the watchful eyes of the keepers and the new Order of the Embers. It was an arrangement that seemed to promise a lasting peace. The keepers themselves, having endured centuries hidden in volcanic chasms, were eager to secure stable relationships with foreign powers so they might quietly tend to their core mission, the stewardship of dragons and the guardianship of Valyrian knowledge. As for Westeros, Raella's openness to arcane research brought new prospects to the Red Keep. Maesters who once thought magic was folly began tentatively studying it under the guidance of newly arrived Valyrian emissaries, discovering at least some rational underpinnings beneath the old sorceries. Meanwhile, the forging of a few fresh Valyrian steel blades, overseen by the keepers under controlled circumstances, filled the realm with awe and speculation. Yet the secrets behind those forging rituals remained closely guarded. It was enough, for now, that the finished swords existed at all, shimmering with inky luster and bearing runes that sparked the imagination. Not everything proved simple. Beneath the veneer of calm, tension simmered. Word of fresh-forged Valyrian steel and newly hatched dragons incited envy in the free cities. Magisters who had once dismissed Valyria's return as a hoax now scrambled to gauge whether these new Dragonriders posed a threat to their commerce or influence. Braavos, with its storied enmity toward old Valyria, maintained a cool neutrality, never forgetting how the Faceless Men supposedly orchestrated many a death among the old dragon lords. Volantis, which had always claimed a direct lineage from the Freehold, bristled that they were no longer the closest inheritors of ancient Valyrian ways. Whispers of sabotage circulated, Rumors that certain Volantine archons might sponsor pirate fleets to harass or block the flow of trade into the Smoking Sea. But for a time, the might of dragons kept such threats at bay. The presence of winged sentinels in the skies above the peninsula deterred most opportunistic attacks. With watchers on the city's high spires, the approach of any hostile force was noticed far in advance. The transformation of the city and its immediate environs into a well-defended haven continued, forging a delicate balance. Those who came peacefully were welcomed, and those who meant harm faced the lethal reality of dragonfire. As reborn Valyria flourished, so too did Queen Raella's life and rule. Her confidence as a Dragonrider and as a monarch seemed to intensify hand in hand. She spent stretches of time in King's Landing fulfilling royal duties, then took flight back across the narrow sea for weeks on end to oversee new building projects in Valyria, and to confer with the keepers regarding the mysteries that still haunted the Smoking Sea. The small folk in both realms began to tell stories of the Queen of Two Thrones, conjuring images of her perched on a basalt dais in Valyria one day, and upon the Iron Throne in Westeros the next. It was an exaggeration. Valyria had no single throne, preferring instead a council of equals led by the senior keepers, but the legend took hold all the same. Her personal bond with Corrigan was an ever-evolving wonder. By the time he was old enough to carry her across entire seas without rest, their mental link had grown to the point that she sometimes felt the edges of his senses brushing her own, even as she slept. She sensed his shifting moods, his impulses to hunt, his occasional jealousies when she showed too much attention to others. The bond was glorious but also sobering. Any misuse of such a connection could break a dragon's spirit or warp a rider's judgment. She strove to maintain humility, mindful of the tragic Targaryen kings who had succumbed to arrogance when their dragons were at their prime. If reborn Valyria was to be a haven, then its guardians had to be wiser than the old empire's warlords. Yet for all the shared progress, the scars left by the cultist uprising lingered in Valyria's undercity. Patrols from the Order of the Ember still discovered hidden passages in the months and years after the siege. Sometimes, in these depths, they stumbled upon twisted remnants of dark experiments. The keepers of the city's archivums debated whether to destroy certain old texts that described dreadful rites, or whether to keep them under lock and key as references for the future. Nightmares from the doomed did not vanish easily. Raella herself would occasionally awaken at night, whether in her chambers at the Red Keep or in the newly reconstructed spire she used in Valyria, sweating from visions of serpentine monstrosities slithering through cracks in the earth. She reminded herself that vigilance was the price of peace. No realm, reborn or otherwise, was free from danger. The hope was that the next generation might inherit fewer burdens. And indeed, in the 10th year following Valyria's rebirth, the realm received joyous news. Queen Raella gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Rumors swirled about their paternity, though the official story was that Raella's consort was a Targaryen cousin from a cadet branch, a mild-mannered lord named Aelix Targaryen. Wherever the truth lay, the realm at large celebrated the arrival of two healthy heirs, for the royal line had been precariously thin. Ceremonies abounded in King's Landing, culminating in an elaborate naming day. The boy was called Rhaegar, in memory of a beloved ancestor. The girl was named Dany's, an homage to the dreamer whose visions had once saved House Targaryen from the doom. Despite the typical wariness about magic, the small folk could not help but be fascinated by the idea that these twins, royal children born into a new age of dragons, might herald unprecedented wonders. The keepers in Valyria sent gifts of carved obsidian and polished black steel, along with a small casket containing unhatched dragon eggs. Although no one expected the eggs to hatch simply for being in the children's presence, the symbolism was potent. It spoke of the enduring bond between Westeros and reborn Valyria, a promise that the blood of dragons would not fade as it had in centuries past. As the twins grew, Raella visited Valyria more frequently, sometimes bringing them along, carefully in their infancy, so they might at least breathe the hot mineral air of their ancestral homeland. The keepers were delighted by the presence of Targaryen children on their soil. In them they saw living links between old and new. On certain auspicious nights, they lit the basalt braziers in the city's grand plaza and offered blessings for the children's health, chanting in low voices that resonated through the fused stone architecture. Still, Not everyone welcomed the idea of Westerosi heirs roaming Valyria's domain. Some of the more isolationist keepers feared undue influence from King's Landing, or that these children, once grown, might claim special authority over reborn Valyria. Internal debates simmered, though they were often kept behind closed doors. For now, the general atmosphere was one of celebration rather than division. By the time Rhaegar and Daenerys had reached their 6th name day, they had grown accustomed to the strangeness of traveling by dragonback with their mother. Though they could not ride Corrigan on their own, each had a small custom saddle harness that attached them firmly to Rhaella's seat. She would cradle one at a time, for it was not safe to fly both together until they were older and take short, gentle flights above the sea near Dragonstone. Their laughter rang out in the wind as they glimpsed the world from above. Occasionally, Corrigan would release a subdued spurt of flame to amuse them, though Rhaella insisted that he only do so far from the children. Even then, she could see the spark of wonder in their eyes. They had the Targaryen look, silver gold hair, bright violet eyes, slender features that promised a certain regal bearing. Yet each child displayed distinct personalities. Rhaegar was quiet, introspective, fascinated by scrolls and stories of old battles. Daenerys was restless, bold, sneaking away from her Septa's lessons whenever she could to explore hidden corridors in the Red Keep or dash through Valyria's half-restored passageways. Meanwhile, across the sea, the re-emergence of Valyrian might continue to stir the political pot in Essos. Smugglers told stories of a growing alliance of worried magisters and princes, resentful or fearful that Valyria might eventually overshadow them. The rumor that the keepers were forging new Valyrian steel swords, albeit in limited quantities, unnerved them. Tales abounded in the markets of Volantis that the keepers of the Old Tiger and Elephant parties considered resurrecting expansionist policies to challenge Valyria. In Lys, various merchant princes whispered that if Valyria truly offered refuge to all manner of sorcerers and arcane students, it might become an epicenter of knowledge that would undercut Lys's own seat of learning and exotic arts. But these cities were not yet united. Rivalries and mutual suspicions prevented them from forming a single coalition. For the moment, that disunity worked in Valyria's favor. Still, reborn Valyria was under no illusions. If the free cities truly wished to muster their resources and test the might of dragons, the city would need every ally it could gather. Against this backdrop, Rhaella and the Keepers convened new treaties, forging closer ties with certain realms that stood to gain from Valyria's success. Pentos, always a city of compromise, welcomed Valyrian ambassadors in the hope of securing favorable trade. Braavos maintained an uneasy watch but had not acted overtly. The Order of the Embers expanded its operations, establishing a small chain of outposts along the coasts nearest to the Smoking Sea, where watchers and dragons could intercept pirate incursions before they threatened merchant shipping. If uneasy peace had taken hold, it was guarded day and night by the vigilance of these riders. Still, rumors alone do not precipitate war. For a number of years, the tension remained just that, tension. Queen Rhaella found time to oversee the continuing reconstruction in Valyria. The Keepers had decided to restore one of the city's grand aqueducts, channeling purified water from distant springs fed by underground rivers. That single feat of engineering, combining arcane wards with advanced masonry, ensured that the city would no longer rely on occasionally toxic local water sources. Under the watchful guidance of the Keeper who specialized in healing arts, cleansing runes were carved into the stone to neutralize harmful substances. The result was a network of fountains that turned a once sulfurous ruin into a place capable of supporting thousands more inhabitants in relative comfort. Skilled workers from the free cities, from the Summer Isles, and even from distant Korth, arrived to lend their talents in exchange for a chance to behold a land of dragons. With new life and possibility came new perils. Explorers ventured deeper inland, seeking to reclaim old roads that once linked city-states along the Valyrian peninsula. They encountered valleys blanketed by glassy volcanic residue, cliffs that crumbled underfoot, pockets of lethal gas that could kill a man in seconds. Sometimes entire sections of road caved into hidden caverns. The explorers also reported sightings of strange creatures, fireworms, scaled predators adapted to living in the high-temperature wastes, and packs of mutated beasts that seemed half lizard, half wolf. Several times the Keepers dispatched search and rescue flights when expeditions went missing. Harrowing stories returned with the survivors, tunnels lit by phosphorescent fungus, half-buried ruins haunted by ash wraiths, and grotesque silhouettes prowling the edges of the torchlight. In response, a new initiative took shape in reborn Valyria, a ranger-like organization tasked with mapping and securing the peninsula. Dubbed the Ashen Wings, these volunteers combined Dragonriders with skilled foot scouts. Their mission was to chart passable routes, locate pockets of lingering sorcery or curses from the Doom, and keep a watchful eye for any reemergence of the cult or similarly dark influences. Over time, they found numerous small enclaves of survivors, descendants of those who had hidden in isolated caves for generations, living off subterranean fungi and hunting fire lizards. These enclaves were often wary of outsiders, their dialects so twisted it took months for interpreters to decipher them. Some accepted relocation to the city, while others vanished into deeper tunnels rather than join a world they believed was cursed. Through these expansions, the Keepers learned more about Valyria's shattered geography. They discovered the remnants of old wards that had once tempered the tectonic furies of the 14 Flames. The wards, powered by a synergy of runes and living dragon magic, had apparently been integral to keeping the city stable in the time before the Doom. Their failure had accelerated the cataclysm. Now the Keepers dared to hope that by restoring them in carefully chosen locations, they might ensure reborn Valyria would never again succumb to an eruption on the same scale. But the knowledge was incomplete, the runes battered and partially lost to time. They needed more texts from old archives scattered across Essos, or from hidden vaults rumored to lie beneath the ruins of the ancient Valyrian capital. At times, Raella would join expeditions searching for these lost wards. She flew on Corrigan alongside a retinue of older Keepers, descending into labyrinthine ruins. They brought arcane instruments that measured geothermal pulses, or so the Keepers claimed. Sometimes, they found partial success, dormant obelisks carved with Valyrian glyphs, quietly humming with residual magic. Placing her hand upon one of those obelisks gave Raella a brief, eerie sensation of hearing distant roars, as though the centuries themselves still carried the echoes of ancient dragons. The experience left her shaken, reminding her how little was truly understood about the old empire's magical underpinnings. Her children, meanwhile, grew from curious youngsters to adolescents who each showed inclinations toward the Dragonrider path. Rhaegar displayed a surprising knack for memorizing arcane glyphs and genealogies, though he was physically timid around the older dragons. Dany's, in contrast, was physically fearless. She had no qualms running up to a hatchling and letting it sniff her hand, but she possessed less patience for dusty tomes and riddling incantation. Each child seemed to embody a different facet of House Targaryen's legacy, and Raella resolved not to force them into roles. If Rhaegar wished to study as a scholar of Valyria's arcane mysteries, so be it. If Dany's yearned to become a rider who roamed the skies on scouting missions, Raella would not stand in her way. Yet she also cautioned them about the potential pitfalls. She recounted the tragedies of Targaryen history, of princes and princesses who thought themselves gods among mortals, only to fall to madness or misfortune. She implored them to respect the line between mortal and dragon, to cherish the bond without letting it devour their sense of mercy. By the twins' 13th name day, they accompanied their mother more regularly to Valyria. Each was given a small suite of rooms near the top of one of the city's newly refurbished spires, lit by arcane braziers to cut through the sooty gloom. The swirl of activity outside their windows fascinated them. Dragons in flight, workers hauling stone on giant pulley systems, foreign envoys arriving with goods for trade or knowledge to share. One day, Rhaegar and Daenys were caught sneaking out of the spire on their own, venturing into the city's back alleys in the hope of meeting a rumored dragon whisperer, a reclusive man who, it was said, could calm the most volatile drakes. They found him, a scarred keeper named Ulivar, who had once been part of the Undercity struggle against the cult. He was patient with them, teaching them how to approach adolescent dragons without provoking fear or aggression. Though Raella frowned on their unauthorized excursion, she ultimately saw value in Ulivar's instruction. She encouraged their curiosity, trusting that they were old enough to begin forging their own knowledge. It was around this time that Raella also noticed Daenys' rebellious streak growing stronger. The girl chafed at the protocols of court life, the tedious ceremonies, and especially the notion that she must remain a princess, while her mother and the older keepers took to the skies against potential threats. Sometimes Danes would pick friendly fights with the older squires in the courtyard, determined to prove she could handle a blade just as well. Rhaegar, more reserved, spent his free hours in the archives, poring over whatever arcane fragments the keepers allowed him to see. He discovered references to an artifact known as the Scepter of Unmaking, a legendary tool rumored to have played a role in the Doom. The archivists insisted many such references were myth, but Rhaegar felt a strange pull whenever he read of it, as though the words were trying to guide him somewhere. Life in reborn Valyria reached a new level of prosperity around the 18th year after the city's official irebirth. The expansions into the peninsula's hinterlands had opened new farmland in geothermally heated valleys. Small fishing villages sprang up along the coast. Merchant vessels openly traded with the city, bringing in textiles, grains, and livestock in exchange for rare metals, advanced smithing techniques, and glimpses of the dragons themselves. In King's Landing, some lords complained that the queen spent too much time in Valyria, while others praised her for establishing a stable supply of exotic goods that enriched the crown's coffers. The tension between her roles as Westerosi monarch and Valyrian ally continued, but the realm at large enjoyed an era of relative peace. With the memory of the cult's devastation fading, the city's population grew in confidence, if not complacency. Then came a series of ominous events that heralded fresh danger. It began with unsettling tales from the far interior of Essos, accounts of large, organized slave caravans moving north from Slaver's Bay, heading in the vague direction of Valyria. The region had been shattered by the Doom, but enterprising slavers had always exploited chaos to expand their operations. Now, it seemed they were not content merely to capture refugees and stragglers. They had begun systematically raiding inland pockets near the Smoking Sea, possibly to gather offerings. The keepers flew reconnaissance, discovering encampments of armed men bearing a strange insignia. A stylized black sun shot through with a crimson slash. Some of the slaves they freed spoke of a grand temple being built somewhere across the volcanically scarred plains, though they had never seen it. Others mentioned the name Naga Shai, as if it were some revered power. The keepers recognized nothing of that name, but they suspected foul sorceries might be in play again. Reports of increased slaver activity alone would have been cause for alarm. But soon, travelers passing near the peninsula claimed to see black-robed figures wandering the coasts, chanting in a language reminiscent of High Valyrian but twisted into atonal ululations. Some watchers on the city walls swore they saw flickers of green flame out at sea late at night, perhaps illusions, perhaps signals. The older keepers muttered that such signs could mean a resurgence of cultic practices. The city braced for a possible infiltration. Patrols were doubled. The Ashen Wings scoured the outer roads. But the threat, if it was out there, remained amorphous, slipping through the cracks of the ashen wilderness. One afternoon, Danes rode out with a small band of young riders. None fully bonded, for their dragons were still in training, to do a perimeter sweep. They soared above old lava flows and broken spires of black stone. Danes, riding behind an older squire, clung to the leather harness of a drake named Silverian, a lithe creature with pearlescent scales. From above, the land below looked static, silent. But as they veered around a jagged ridge, they discovered a clearing strewn with makeshift tents. At first glance, it seemed like a band of ragged refugees. Danes felt compassion stirring. Maybe these were outcasts who needed help? But her intuition warned otherwise. Descending carefully, the riders saw that the tents bristled with a strange formation of stakes and bones. As they circled lower, two tall figures in black robes emerged from one of the tents, pointing skyward with unsettling calm. A moment later, arrows shot up in an organized volley. The young riders startled, pulling their dragons higher. Silverian hissed as an arrow grazed his flank. More figures appeared, at least 40 or 50 men armed with crossbows. And in the midst of the tents, Danes glimpsed a horrifying sight. A row of captives chained to stakes, half-starved, their eyes wild with terror. The black-robed individuals turned to them with ritualistic knives, as if preparing to spill blood for some dark rite, the moment they realized they had been discovered. Danes felt a rush of righteous fury. She shouted at the other riders to ascend and signal for help, but her sense of bravery, and perhaps reckless defiance, drove her to act. She knew only minimal flame emanated from Silverian's throat at this youthful stage, but it might be enough to disrupt whatever vile ritual was about to happen. Before the older squire could stop her, Dany spurred Silverian into a diving pass, urging him to unleash flame upon the black-robed figures. A burst of flickering fire spouted from the drake's jaws, igniting tents and sending robed cultists scattering. Crossbow bolts whizzed by. Silverian shrieked in pain as one found its mark. Another slammed into the squire's shoulder, causing him to lose his grip and tumble from the saddle, plummeting into the chaos below. Dany's barely managed to hang on. Silverian roared in panic, flapping awkwardly, searching for altitude. But the injury hindered him. Dany's had no skill in controlling a wounded dragon from the front seat. She realized with dread that she might crash. She tugged on the harness, attempting to steer Silverian away from the largest knot of crossbowmen. More arrows streaked upward. One clipped Dany's across the temple, and everything spun. The last thing she saw was the ground rushing up, the dizzy swirl of shapes, and the sound of savage shouts. She awoke sometime later with a throbbing head wound, and her entire body bound in coarse rope. Moonlight glimmered on black spires in the distance. A wretched stench of burning flesh and metal hung in the air. She realized she had been taken to a different part of the camp, a clearing where the captive stakes were arrayed in a semicircle. Silverian lay nearby, limp and moaning, one wing pinned under a felled tree. Her squire's body was nowhere to be seen, likely he had perished in the fall. The robed figures huddled around a makeshift altar, chanting as they lit braziers filled with a pungent, smoky substance. Torchlight flickered on faces etched with a fanatical intensity. She recognized the same black sun insignia with the crimson slash, displayed on banners. A man with a golden mask, carved to resemble a dragon's skull, stood at the center, leading the chant. Dany's heart hammered. She tried to wriggle free of the ropes, but her arms were painfully secured behind her back. She watched in mounting horror as the man in the dragon's skull mask advanced. He carried a short blade of black steel etched with runes that glowed green in the firelight. His voice rose echoing in the night. "We gather in the presence of Nagashai, the devouring flame. We bring this child of dragons as an offering to the old power. From her blood, we shall glean the secrets of Valyria's new wards, and from her death, we shall conjure forth the cataclysm that was never fully sated." Dany swallowed her terror, forcing her mind to stay sharp. She was certain that more riders would come searching for her. But would they arrive in time? Already her vision blurred from her injuries. She felt the rope biting into her skin. The chant intensified. Nearby cultists dragged a terrified captive forward and slit his throat over a stone basin, letting the blood stream into runic grooves. A nauseating wave of helplessness swept over her. She had never witnessed such grotesque cruelty up close. The memory of the half-suppressed histories, the cult that had nearly overthrown reborn Valyria years ago, flooded her thoughts. Were these the remnants of that cult or something new, more widespread? Across the clearing, Silverian groaned. The drake tried to lift his head, eyes burning with fear and confusion. The broken wing pinned him. Dany couldn't even shout to soothe him. But she had read of dragon-human bonds, how sometimes a rider could calm or embolden a dragon with her presence. Closing her eyes, ignoring the robed zealots chanting, Dany tried to summon every ounce of mental focus. She pictured Silverian's warmth, the memory of him nuzzling her hand in the training yard. She willed him to sense her calm, to draw on her resolve. For a moment, it seemed pointless. He was wounded and pinned. Yet, gradually, she felt something shift. Silverian's low whine turned into a growl. His claws scraped the ground. Smoke billowed from his jaws. One of the cultists noticed. "Subdue that beast," he shouted. A pair of men with spears approached the drake, jabbing at his flanks. Silverian roared in pain, thrashing. Dany saw the trunk pinning his wing move slightly. If he could wrench himself free, they might stand a chance. Gritting her teeth, she twisted her wrists. The rope tore painfully at her skin, but she felt a strand give way. She had to keep them distracted. She mustered the bravado she could, shouting, "Do you think killing me will break the line of dragons? Valyria already crushed your kind once before. You'll end in ashes." The man in the dragon skull mask only laughed, his voice muffled behind the carved visage. "You think me a deluded follower of those who came before? No, child. The shadows of old Valyria only hinted at the power that truly lurks beneath the 14 flames. We serve that power. We shall bring about a second doom, and from that apocalypse a new world will be born. Oh. He lifted the glowing dagger, approaching Dany's with deliberate steps. Her heart pounded, but she refused to cower. She yanked at the rope again, feeling more fibers snap. The chanting built to a crescendo, accompanied by the drumming of fists on the ground. The masked leader raised the blade high. Suddenly, a horn blast split the night sky. A second, then a third. At the edge of the clearing, shapes erupted from the darkness. Half a dozen Dragonriders of the Order of the Embers, led by none other than Queen Raella herself, astride Corrigan. Their arrival was a fury of fire and steel. Cultists scrambled, some dropping to their knees in fanatic ecstasy, others fleeing in terror. Corrigan blasted a plume of flame that lit up the entire camp. Tents ignited, wooden stakes crackled into cinders. The ground shook with the dragon's landing. Raella leaped down sword in hand, flanked by knights who charged the robed zealots. Chaos ensued as crossbows fired, arcs of greenish fire erupted from braziers, and the cult's monstrous foot soldiers, hulking brutes wearing hammered plates, rushed forward. But the order had come prepared. They tore through the camp, cutting cultists down and freeing captives. Silverian roared anew, emboldened by Corrigan's presence. With a surge of frantic strength, he heaved the trunk aside, snapping his wing free. Though injured, he limped forward, snapping at the men who had tormented him. Dany seized the moment to tear the last of her ropes. She rolled away before a frantic cultist could grab her, scooped up a discarded spear, and stabbed him in the thigh. He collapsed with a scream. For a heartbeat, Dany's locked eyes with her mother across the battlefield. Raella's expression was one of mingled relief and rage. Then the masked leader intervened, stepping between them. He hurled some kind of black powder to the ground, conjuring a swirling cloud of green flame that forced Raella to back away. Dany felt a sudden wave of nausea, her senses reeling. The masked man's voice chanted in a guttural tongue. Slivers of that green flame coalesced around his dagger, forming a vile aura. Dany had no training in magic, only the raw fear in her gut that told her to run. But as she scrambled to get her bearings, he lunged, blade raised. Before he could strike, Corrigan's tail lashed out from the side, smashing the masked man aside. The blow hurled him into a collapsing tent. Dany heard him cry out, but whether in agony or in continuing fury, she couldn't tell. She darted out of the flame-choked clearing, heading towards Silverian. More horn blasts sounded as a second wave of riders arrived overhead. The night became a chaotic inferno. Cultists scattered in all directions. Some flung themselves into the path of the dragons, chanting praises to Nagashai as they were consumed by fire. Others tried to surrender, dropping their weapons. The captives who could run fled into the darkness, many weeping with relief. Dany, half stumbling from her head wound, reached Silverian just as the drake coughed up a sputtering flame at a charging zealot. She dropped the spear and pressed her hands to Silverian's snout, whispering calming words, though tears streamed down her cheeks. She had never seen such ruthless depravity. Her illusions of honorable battle shattered in that single brutal confrontation. Raella found her moments later. Blood smeared the queen's forehead where her helm had been knocked aside, but her eyes blazed. She knelt, pulling Dany into a tight embrace. The dragons roared in tandem, their heat washing over the battlefield as knights mopped up the remaining resistance. Where the masked leader had fallen, only smoldering wreckage remained. No body was found. Some believed he had been incinerated by Corrigan's strike. Others muttered that sorcery had carried him away. They spent the rest of the night tending to the wounded and freeing any captives they could find. When dawn broke, the camp was reduced to scorched earth and scattered bones. Of Dany's squire, there was no sign. Likely dead. Several other riders had perished in the furious melee. But Dany's was alive, battered and haunted, and Silverian would heal with proper care. Raella dispatched messengers at once, calling for the Order of the Embers to intensify their vigilance. She also wrote urgent letters to the Keeper's Council, warning of this new threat. In the following weeks, the truth began to emerge in fragments. Survivors from the camp reported hearing references to a grand temple somewhere to the east, where a high priest of Nagashai orchestrated sacrificial rites in the hope of triggering a second cataclysm. They believed Valyria's resurrection was an affront to the ancient powers that once consumed the freehold in molten wrath. These zealots considered themselves agents of that power, tasked with wiping away the last vestiges of the Dragonlords. Their black sun sigil was increasingly spotted on clandestine ships and hidden outposts. It became clear that the cult Raella's generation had previously fought was just one cell of a larger movement, a hydra with many heads, spreading across the disordered territories of Essos. The Keepers, appalled, recognized that this was a threat too large for them to contain alone. They called upon all eyes to assist in uprooting the cult. Word spread across Essos that Valyria and the Targaryens were mustering forces to protect the region from a doomsday sect. Though some city-states turned a blind eye, preferring to let Valyria handle its own problems, others saw an opportunity to strengthen ties. Pentosmere, even certain factions within Lyce, sent envoys promising limited support if it meant curbing the rise of fanatics who threatened trade routes and sowed chaos. Mercenary companies that once might have hesitated to work for Valyrians found themselves well paid to patrol the roads leading to the Smoking Sea, flushing out cultist hitouts for bounties. The changed political landscape suggested that perhaps reborn Valyria had become integral to preventing a wider meltdown across Essos. Amid these preparations for a broader conflict, Dany struggled with the aftermath of her ordeal. Though physically she healed, the nightmares persisted. She had taken a life for the first time, stabbing that cultist in the leg, and she replayed the moment again and again, wondering if there had been another way. She mourned her squire, tortured by guilt that her own impulsiveness had led to his death. Raella tried to comfort her, explaining that the blood of the dragon was no shield against pain or regret. Yet Dany's eyes had lost some of their bright innocence. She was quick to train, to push her battered body in sparring sessions, as if building her skill might prevent future tragedies. The older Keepers, seeing her turmoil, took her under their wing, teaching her meditative techniques that once helped riders stabilize their bond with dragons after trauma. It helped, if only slightly, to reassure Silverian that she was emotionally present. Rhaegar, affected in his own way, worried for his sister. He had not been there when the cult nearly sacrificed her. He was safe in Valyria's libraries, studying glyphs and half-lost illusions. He began feeling a gnawing sense of inadequacy. Though he knew many secrets of the old empire, he was helpless in open battle. Determined to prove his worth, he devoted himself to bridging his scholarship with practical defense of the realm. Under the tutelage of certain keepers who specialized in arcane wards, he learned to channel small illusions and protective runes, though he lacked the raw magical potential some rumored Targaryens once had. Still, he possessed an uncanny knack for deciphering cryptic texts. With each passing day, he gleaned more references to this Nagashai cult, cross-referencing them with what he knew of Valyrian theology. The name was absent from mainstream Valyrian records, suggesting it was either a suppressed heresy or an external power. One passage suggested Nagashai was a draconic entity of primordial flame, older than the freehold itself, an echo of the living volcanoes. Whether that was literal or figurative remained unclear. As the months rolled on, a newfound sense of urgency gripped reborn Valyria. Skilled riders flew out in all directions, searching for any sign of hidden outposts. Ambassadors in the free cities tried to coordinate intelligence. The roads leading to the city bristled with newly constructed watchtowers. Blacksmiths toiled day and night to produce arms, some of them nearly as fine as Valyrian steel, though lacking its fabled properties. The keepers held solemn gatherings in the same mosaic-floored courtyard where Raella had once been greeted so many years ago. Now the number of participants was larger, the city more populous, and the weight of leadership heavier. They reviewed charts, debated strategies, and made contact with allied powers that might assist in the event of an outright war. Tension lay thick on the air, a sense that reborn Valyria stood on the precipice. They had risen from the ashes once, forging a peaceful haven for dragons and men. Would they now be forced to unleash dragon fire across half of Essos to quell a fanatic uprising? One day, high above the city's spires, a watch horn sounded an alarm. A battered merchant vessel appeared in the harbor, flying flags of distress. The crew, mostly from Lyce and Tyrosh, bore news that an army of robed zealots, bearing the Black Sun insignia, had sacked a small settlement on an island near the old Valyrian coast. Survivors reported that the cult practiced vile sacrifices, claiming they sought to rouse the ancient flames beneath the sea. The city erupted into a warlike frenzy. Enough was enough. If the cult was moving so openly, they had to be stopped before their power spread. Queen Rhaella convened an emergency council with the Keepers. Proposals ranged from launching a full-scale military expedition with dragons leading the charge, to forging a coalition of the free cities to crush the cult. But so many aspects remained uncertain. The cult's true strength, its bases of operation, and the identities of those fueling its expansion. As the debate escalated, Daenerys, still recovering but fiercely determined, interrupted. She insisted the city dispatch an elite group to the rumored Grand Temple that captives had spoken of. If they could strike at the heart of the cult and disrupt its leadership, maybe the entire movement would collapse. Many objected that this was far too risky, but Daenerys had a surprising ally, Rhaegar, who posited that, based on the fragments he had read, the cult was performing major rites at that temple during the next lunar eclipse, which was only weeks away. If they allowed the ritual to proceed, it might indeed trigger a catastrophic surge in volcanic or arcane energies. Ultimately, Rhaella and the Keepers agreed to a bold plan. A combined strike force, Dragonriders, ground troops, and a handful of arcane specialists would slip into the eastern interior under cover of darkness, locate the temple, and destroy whatever ritual was in progress. Meanwhile, reborn Valyria's main defensive force would guard the city in case the move was a diversion. Word was sent to certain free cities, requesting that they mount their own distractions elsewhere, scattering the cult's attention. Preparations began immediately. Daenerys insisted on joining, though her mother was hesitant after nearly losing her once. Yet Daenerys argued passionately that she knew what this cult was capable of, that her presence might rally other young riders. Silverian, while still healing, was airworthy enough for short flights. At last, Rhaella yielded, unwilling to stifle the girl's determination. Rhaegar declared he would remain in Valyria, coordinating intelligence and further research on the wards that might neutralize any magical conflagration. 2 nights before the expedition set off, Daenerys wandered through the half-finished corridors of a new spire in reborn Valyria. She wore a simple tunic, her hair bound in a single braid, a contrast to the silks and jewels she was expected to display as a princess. Torchlight revealed carved stone reliefs of dragons swirling in stylized flames. She paused at a small balcony overlooking the city's main plaza, where a statue of Aenar Targaryen, commissioned by some patriotic souls, stood half-completed. She felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her. Could she, a girl of 15, truly help defeat a threat that had eluded older, wiser riders? She startled as her mother appeared quietly beside her. Rhaella wore a plain cloak, her hair unbound, silver-streaked with a few lines of age. "Can't sleep?" the queen asked gently. Daenerys shook her head. Rhaella placed a hand on her shoulder. "You remind me so much of myself at your age, though perhaps I was never so bold. I sense your fear, but also your resolve." Daenerys swallowed hard. "Mother, what if my recklessness brings more harm? I can't forget the squire who died. I can't forget those captives being tortured. All I've seen is that whenever I act from impulse, people die." Rhaella's eyes shone with compassion. "You made a mistake. Mistakes happen in war, especially to the young who haven't learned the cost of each decision. You learned it now, cruelly, but if you let that guilt paralyze you, more innocents might suffer. Take the lesson." A silent tear traced Daenerys' cheek. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. They stood thus for a long moment, mother and daughter, each carrying the burdens of their legacy. Outside, the city's lights flickered in the gloom. A pair of dragons soared overhead in silent patrol, their silhouettes crossing the moonlit sky. Finally, Daenerys nodded, determination gathering in her chest once more. 2 days later, under a moonless sky, the strike force embarked. A dozen Dragonriders set forth, flying low to avoid detection, accompanied by a ground contingent traveling by hidden routes. They navigated broken terrain lit only by starlight. Smoke vents hissed from the land's interior. The stench of sulfur thickened as they ventured closer to the rumored seat of cult activity. Scouts reported seeing groups of armed men marching in ragged columns, chanting ominous prayers. As they advanced, Rhaella's formation discovered the remains of a village, deserted, except for corpses and black sun symbols daubed on walls with congealed blood. The cruelty angered everyone. They pressed on, mindful of how quickly the cult had spread. On the second night, a roving band of zealots spotted one of the ground patrols, prompting a skirmish. Dragonriders intervened, unleashing flame from above, scattering the enemy. But the cultists, undeterred, stood their ground longer than expected, as if unafraid of death. It took a concentrated barrage of steel and fire to break them. Interrogations gleaned little information aside from maddened rants about the approach of the eclipse and the unquenchable flame. The infiltration would not remain secret for long. By the third night, the force reached a labyrinth of canyons carved by ancient lava flows. Seismic tremors shook the ground at intervals, a sign that the geologic unrest might be rising. Smoke or steam vented from cracks in the basalt. The air was so thick with hot fumes that the dragons found it hard to maintain altitude. Scouts returned with a crucial discovery. Perched atop a plateau near the largest fissure was a massive stone structure that could only be the temple. Torches ringed its perimeter, forming a giant symbol of the black sun. The chanting that drifted on the wind was audible even from miles away, an atonal drone that set nerves on edge. As the eclipse drew near, the force made camp in a hidden ravine, planning a final assault timed to disrupt the ritual at its height. Tension and dread filled the hours. Rayla walked among her knights, quietly offering encouragement. The Valyrian keepers who accompanied them chanted protective words. Dany stood by Silverian, checking the straps on his harness, ignoring the trembling in her hands. She wished her brother were there, his calm presence, his studious mind. But she knew someone had to remain behind, and she was determined to prove herself. Finally, the hour arrived. The moon overhead began its slow march into the path of the sun, casting an eerie half-light across the land. The chanting from the temple rose in volume, echoing through the canyons. The strike force emerged from their hiding places, pushing forward. Dragonriders soared as high as the fumes allowed, preparing to unleash a coordinated bombardment. On the ground, ranks of cult warriors met them with a fury that seemed fueled by mania. The collision of steel rang out in the gloom. Arrows whistled, men screamed, dragons roared. Rayla led the aerial charge on Corrigan, diving into a cluster of cultists who manned makeshift ballistae. Flames ripped through the siege engines. The ground lit up with swirling fires. Dany's, flying beside her mother, had never been in a battle of this scale. Even her previous horror in the cult camp did not compare. Everywhere was chaos, shouts, explosions, the crash of rubble when the trembling earth gave way. She steeled herself, guiding Silverian to circle the edges of the temple platform. She saw robed figures lined in a circle, their voices joined in a continuous chant. At the circle's center stood a towering statue, a skeletal dragon coiled around a spire of black stone. The statue's eyes glowed with the same sickly green that had haunted her nightmares. A wave of crossbow bolts soared toward her. Silverian twisted in midair, but one bolt caught Dany's in the calf. She cried out, nearly losing her grip. Pain flared, yet she clenched her teeth, pressing Silverian to continue circling. Rayla swooped down, incinerating the crossbowmen with precise bursts of flame. On the ground, allied soldiers battered at the temple gates. Already, the cult was mustering monstrous creatures from within, bare-chested brutes with unnatural muscles, frothing at the mouth. The front lines collided in a savage melee. Then, as the moon slid fully into the sun's path, darkness descended like a veil. The world took on a blood-hued cast, save for a ring of crimson light behind the black disk. The chanting from within the temple soared to a climax. It felt as though the land itself responded, trembling with rhythmic intensity. Fissures in the ground spewed plumes of superheated steam. Molten rock glowed in cracks that formed beneath the temple. Danis's heart thundered. Was this the doom they feared? High atop the temple's main terrace, a lone figure emerged, the man in the dragon skull mask. Though she could not see his face, Dany's recognized his presence by the cold dread it evoked. He raised his arms, shouting in a voice amplified by some arcane force. Witness the final awakening. Tremble before Nagashai, whose flame shall devour the unworthy. You who cling to Valyria's false rebirth shall be consumed in the true fire. Oh! Bolts of greenish lightning crackled around him. He hurled one toward Rayella, who barely guided Corrigan aside in time. Another struck a cluster of allied soldiers on the ground, sending them flying in arcs of crackling energy. Dany's blood ran cold. She had never seen a sorcery so direct and destructive. This masked figure indeed commanded dreadful power. From the corners of the temple courtyard, more robed figures appeared, each brandishing glyph-etched staves. Together, they channeled swirling energy into the statue at the center. The stone spire that the skeletal dragon effigy coiled around began to pulse, sending shockwaves through the air. Corrigan roared, diving at the masked leader. But the figure unleashed a barrier of green flame, causing the dragon to recoil, snarling in frustration. Rayella circled back, shouting for the keepers to assist. They needed to break this magical stronghold. On the ground, a handful of arcane specialists from Valyria attempted to cast wards of their own. But the swirling miasma of the temple's corrupted magic disrupted their efforts. Dany's, panting, blood still trickling from her wounded leg, realized that someone had to breach the circle of chanting cultists and disrupt their ritual from within. Summoning her courage, she urged Silverian into a dive. She soared low over the courtyard, weaving among fallen pillars and rubble as crossbowmen fired sporadically. The circle of chanting zealots was in sight, each enthralled by their dark incantation. If she could just break their ranks, maybe the energy feeding the statue would falter. Silverian screeched, loosing a spout of flame that set half the circle ablaze, but new cultists rushed forward to take their place, chanting in a rising crescendo. The wave of raw magic battered Dany's senses, making her vision blur. She clung to the harness, fighting dizziness. On the far side of the courtyard, Rayella noticed Dany's maneuver and swooped in to help. She and Corrigan landed with a thunderous impact, crushing cultists underfoot. The masked leader snarled, directing a spear of crackling energy at Rayella. Corrigan flung himself in the way, scales sizzling where the energy impacted. Smoke and the stench of burnt flesh rose. Rayella slashed with her Valyrian steel sword, sending a ripple of power back at the masked man, but he deflected it with a swirl of green flame. The air was alive with sparks and howling wind. The temple grounds threatened to buckle under the strain. Dany saw her chance. She guided Silverian into a precarious landing behind the circle, leaping off the dragon's back despite the pain in her leg. She stumbled, nearly collapsing, but pushed forward. Each step was agony. Cultists turned, brandishing wicked blades. She deflected one strike with the small buckler strapped to her arm, then thrust her sword into the assailant's chest. Another lunged, forcing her to spin aside, ignoring the arrow of pain shooting up her wounded calf. Silverian bounded forward, snapping at robed figures, tail lashing to knock them away. In a swirl of violence, Dany's broke into the chanting circle, slicing into the zealot whose voice carried the loudest resonance. He fell, blood pouring from a sliced jugular, but instead of horror, his eyes burned with unholy ecstasy. The chanting faltered momentarily, the green aura flickering around the statue's base. A wave of empowerment surged through Dany's chest, not from any dark source but from the raw adrenaline of small victory. She pressed on, hacking at the next cultist. The figure tried to conjure a flame of their own, but Silverian's roar drowned it out, snapping them in half with his jaws. The circle collapsed in confusion. The rhythmic chanting stumbled. The swirling light around the statue guttered. Rayella took advantage of the lull, spurring Corrigan to unleash his mightiest column of fire at the masked leader. The man raised his staff, managing to absorb some of the flame, but the backlash knocked him to his knees. Just as Dany's dared to hope that the ritual would be fully broken, a deep tremor shook the temple. Fissures widened, spilling gouts of molten rock. The statue at the center cracked. A monstrous sound rumbled from within it, as if something ancient and enraged stirred. Green light erupted from the fracture in the stone. Dany's, drenched in sweat and blood, shielded her eyes. A hideous shriek echoed across the plateau, and a spectral shape burst out of the statue's husk, a draconic outline made of swirling green flames, huge and terrible. It roared, sending shockwaves of scorching heat. Cultists on both sides were blasted off their feet. Soldiers scrambled for cover. The spectral dragon, if that was what it was, glared about with eyes like blazing embers, as though seeking a physical host to inhabit. Danis felt a strangling terror. Was this Nagashai itself? Some twisted echo of the ancient doom? The masked leader, battered but still alive, staggered to his feet. With trembling arms, he reached toward the entity. "That gate is open," he hissed in triumph. "Come forth, O devouring one." But at that moment, the spectral dragon lurched, as though disoriented. Its gaze fell upon the masked man. With an ear-splitting roar, it seized him in talon-like coils of green fire, incinerating him from within. He shrieked, his mask melting into his flesh, a grotesque fusion of bone and metal. Danis watched in horror as the entity seemed to feed on his life force, his body withering like a husk. Then it cast aside his remains, whirling in savage confusion, flapping wings of flame that scorched the air. Chunks of the statue rained down. The ground trembled violently, and a crater began forming beneath the temple, molten rock seething. Raella, seeing that the ritual had spun out of control, shouted for all to retreat. Yet the spectral dragon appeared maddened, swirling over the courtyard, unleashing blasts of green fire that set the temple ablaze. Cultists and allied troops alike scattered. Danis cried out as one of the blasts struck near her, sending her sprawling. Silverian shielded her from the brunt of it with his body, but let out a pained roar. Raella and Corrigan flew overhead, attempting to find a weakness. The intangible nature of the entity made it difficult to strike. Flame and steel passed through it without effect. Despair threatened to swallow them all. Had they unleashed an unstoppable horror? Then, above the din, a new roar joined the fray. Danis lifted her head, dazed. Another dragon soared into view, a pale greenish beast, carrying a rider in dark robes. At first, she feared reinforcements for the cult. But as the dragon swept closer, she recognized the rider's posture. It was Rhaegar. He had come despite the plan to remain behind. She could see his hair blowing in the heat, his violet eyes shining. He held some sort of staff with a shimmering gemstone at its tip. The dragon, an older female named Veronese, on loan from one of the keepers, executed a swift dive over the courtyard. Rhaegar extended the staff, and a pulse of whitish-blue light erupted, colliding with the spectral dragon. The entity howled, recoiling as though scalded. Raella seized the moment, guiding Corrigan to unleash a torrent of normal dragon fire. The spectral beast screeched, thrashing in midair. Rhaegar circled again, chanting words Danis could barely hear. The gemstone at his staff glowed brighter, weaving threads of shimmering energy that caught the spectral being's wings. Each lash of green flame diminished slightly under the onslaught. It was not a quick or easy struggle. The entity flailed, setting half the temple ablaze, but it could not break free from the joint assault of Rhaegar's staff and the dragon's fire. At last, with a despairing roar, it collapsed into a whirling vortex of green sparks that spun higher and higher, dissipating into the ash-choked sky. Danis slumped in relief, tears streaking her soot-smeared cheeks. She had no idea how Rhaegar had acquired such arcane power, but in that moment, she only felt gratitude that her brother had intervened. As the final echoes of the spectral dragon's roar faded, the entire temple began to crumble. Molten rock gushed up from the forming crater, consuming the shattered statue. Survivors fled for their lives, leaping across buckling terraces. Dragonriders swooped in to rescue them. Danis, limping badly, was lifted onto Silverians backed by a pair of knights. They took flight moments before the ground collapsed, carrying Danis to safety. Outside, in the more stable land beyond the plateau, the battered force regrouped. The devouring crater swallowed the temple and much of its surroundings, spewing plumes of white-hot smoke and molten debris. The war camp that had once ringed the temple was left in ruins. Many cultists lay dead or dying. Others attempted to flee into the canyons, only to be run down by the allied cavalry or incinerated by dragons. Within hours, the region fell silent except for the rumble of continuing tremors. The Black Sun banners had been reduced to charred scraps. The second doom for now had been averted. Raella embraced Rhaegar the moment he dismounted. She demanded to know how he had come by the staff that subdued the spectral dragon. He admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he had discovered references to an artifact in Valyria's archives, an old staff once used for binding wayward spirits believed to be spawned by the volcanoes. The keepers had it locked away in a vault, uncertain of its function. In desperation, Rhaegar had convinced them to let him attempt to wield it. Though he possessed no great magical power of his own, the staff's enchantments were potent enough to repel or ensnare lesser entities of flame. The journey from Valyria to the temple had been perilous, but he arrived just in time. Both mother and daughter had tears in their eyes, grateful beyond words. Though the victory was decisive, it came at a high cost. Many knights, keepers, and allied soldiers perished in the assault. The body count included good men and women from across Essos, who had rallied to Valyria's call. The temple had been destroyed, along with the monstrous entity the cult had tried to summon in its full form. But not all cultists were accounted for. No one could say for certain if the threat was gone forever, or merely driven underground once more. Exhausted, and mourning the fallen, Rhaella's force returned to reborn Valyria. The city, anxious for news, erupted into mixed cheers and tears when the battered riders flew in. Bells tolled for the dead while crowds gathered to greet the wounded. Dany's was carried off Silverian, her leg wound reopened during the battle, leaving her pale and feverish. Healers quickly whisked her to the newly constructed infirmary where her mother and brother kept vigil. Silverian too required special care, a broken rib and severe burns from the green flames. Over the next days, the two recovered side by side, forging an unshakable bond from the crucible of war. In the weeks that followed, reborn Valyria faced the daunting task of consolidating this victory. Scouts hunted down straggling cult cells in the peninsula. Diplomatic envoys spread word that the dreaded sect had been broken at its source. Some free cities rejoiced openly. Others privately grumbled that Valyria had shown yet again the terrifying power of dragons. Still, the general consensus was that a catastrophic crisis had been averted. Queen Rhaella's name became even more legendary across the continent, though she herself took little pride in it, weighed down by the losses. For Daenys, the ordeal marked a harsh coming of age. Her near sacrifice, her role in breaking the chanting circle, and the final confrontation with the spectral dragon haunted her dreams. But she was no longer the impulsive girl who had recklessly tried to rescue captives on her own. She understood the burden of command and the cost of heroic endeavors. The keepers offered to teach her more advanced techniques for synchronizing with her dragon, seeing in her the raw potential of a new generation that might someday guide Valyria's destiny. Rhaegar too found his calling expanded. He had discovered that knowledge, combined with bravery, could stand against horrors beyond mortal understanding. Yet he also recognized his limits. Wielding the staff took a toll on him, leaving him drained and shaking for days. He resolved to study more, to refine Valyria's wards so that no doomsday cult could so easily threaten the realm again. Together, the twins came to represent a balanced reflection of House Targaryen's heritage, the warrior rider and the scholar seer. Throughout the next year, a gradual peace settled across the peninsula. Mercenary raids from fear-mongering free cities died down as their backers recognized that reborn Valyria remained committed to defense, not conquest. Trade continued to blossom, and the city's population rose. New construction projects aimed to shore up the wards that stabilized the volcanic environment, ensuring the region's viability. In King's Landing, some whispered that Rhaella might soon name one of her children as co-regent, splitting her time fully between Westeros and Valyria. Others speculated she might eventually pass the Iron Throne to one child, and the seat of Valyria to the other, forging a familial bond that spanned seas. Rhaella, for her part, was in no rush to decide. She continued to shuttle between the two realms, using Corrigon's formidable wings. Yet the memory of the cult's near triumph remained a sobering reminder of old Valyria's ghosts. Even in a new era with new ideals, the land was fraught with echoes of the past. Twisted powers still lurked beneath the ground, waiting for opportunists or madmen to stir them. The city's leadership understood now more than ever that vigilance must not falter. They had proven that dragons could defend the living flame of civilization, but it would require unity and constant watchfulness. As Daenys healed, she took quiet walks in the courtyard where she had once seen her mother welcomed by Naris Valar. She remembered the mosaic underfoot, the swirling dragons, and how it had felt to be an onlooker in someone else's legend. Now she found herself at the center of that legend, changed forever. She looked at the grand spires, some newly built, some half-ancient, and listened to the distant roars from roosting dragons. The city felt alive, not just with commerce or pride but with purpose. Her footsteps carried her to the same dais where, so long ago, Raella had spoken to the first generation of keepers who emerged from hiding. She gazed up at the basalt columns, the fused stone that flickered with internal red veins. There she contemplated the fragile wonder that had been built on top of ancient ruin. A swirl of wings signaled the arrival of Silverian, who had been free-flying to build back his strength. He landed heavily, still a bit stiff, but quickly nuzzled her shoulder. She pressed her forehead to his scales, inhaling his sulfur and smoke scent. She sensed his relief, his bond with her stronger than ever. Beyond the courtyard, she saw Corrigan perched on a high tower with Raella on the parapet, speaking to advisors about the next steps to ensure security. And in a nearby terrace, Rhaegar paced with a group of scholars, planning to rework the wards in the city's catacombs. She felt in that moment a surge of admiration and gratitude. They had come from a lineage once nearly extinguished, in a realm turned to ash. Yet here they stood, forging new chapters of a story that might have ended centuries ago. The tension between tradition and innovation would always persist, but she saw no shame in forging ahead, guided by the best lessons of the past rather than the worst. A memory of the masked leader's final shriek flashed in her mind, and she felt a pang of sorrow for all the souls consumed by fanaticism and misguided worship of powers that should remain silent. Time would flow on. Challenges would arise. Perhaps the free cities would rally again in fear of Valyrian might. Perhaps yet another hidden threat would slither from the molten depths. But reborn Valyria had proven it would not repeat the mistakes of old. It had allies. It had watchers. It had a generation of Dragonriders, her generation, willing to wield fire not for blind conquest, but to protect and preserve. That night, Daenerys joined her mother and brother atop the city's highest spire. The sky was clear, dotted with unfamiliar constellations she had never truly noticed. Dragons roosted along the parapets, letting out occasional growls or flutters of their wings. Streams of volcanic heat shimmered in the distance. The city below glowed with torchlight, a gem of civilization carved out of the nightmares left by the doom. Raella turned to her children, voice warm yet resolute. We have come so far together. And we will go farther still. The future belongs to all who choose hope over fear, creation over destruction. This is what a haven for Dragonriders can mean, a place where wonder and power need not be cruel. We stand upon the threshold of so many possibilities. May we never let our vigilance or our compassion falter. Daenerys and Rhaegar nodded, each harboring their own silent thoughts about the path ahead. In the hush that followed, the beating of draconic hearts seemed to resonate through the stone beneath their feet, a living testament that old Valyria, once lost to hubris and flame, had returned, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian standing watch against the darkness that would devour the world if given the chance. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and the city found a fragile equilibrium after the ordeal at the temple. Newly arrived refugees from the ravaged inland spoke of additional isolated cult pockets, but none mounted anything close to the scale of that final confrontation. The Black Sun banner seemed to vanish from the roads. Mercenary bands and local patrols dismantled several shrines dedicated to Nagashai, though no new apparitions rose to challenge the dragons. Perhaps the entity had been banished for good. Perhaps it merely slumbered again, waiting. Either way, reborn Valyria pressed on with its mission. Back in King's Landing, news of the victory brought both relief and fresh anxiety. Lords who had always eyed the Targaryens with suspicion now muttered that Raella's ties to a land of magic and monsters risked bringing unnatural forces into Westeros. Yet the majority, seeing the tangible benefits of Valyrian steel and secure trade, held their tongues. The small folk remained enamored of the idea that dragons once more kept the realm safe from horrors across the sea. Meanwhile, Raella balanced her dual responsibilities, continuing to rule with a light but firm hand, while her children matured into roles that seemed ever more entwined with Valyria's future. Rhaegar, though not as flamboyant as Daenerys, gained quiet respect from the Keepers for his dedication to arcane scholarship. He developed new methods to inscribe wards on the city's walls, combining partial illusions with runic stabilizers. He also devised a rudimentary system to measure seismic disturbances, using crystalline rods that changed color in response to ground tremors. Soon, These rods were placed in watchtowers around the peninsula, giving valuable warnings whenever deeper layers of the smoking sea stirred. Denise continued honing her martial skills, riding frequent patrols to ensure no roving band of slavers or cult remnants endangered the outskirts. Sylvarine recovered from his injuries, emerging stronger and more determined. She found a sense of purpose in defending others, refusing to let any more innocents be sacrificed on altars of madness. The experience had hardened her, yet she retained enough warmth to inspire loyalty among those who followed her. Whispers began that she might, in time, become a leader within the Order of the Embers, perhaps even its commander, if she remained on that path. For Rayella herself, the final years of her reign passed in a flurry of progress and reflection. She oversaw the delicate negotiations that brought Myre and Pentos closer to formal alliances with Valyria. She welcomed maesters to record the city's new history, ensuring that the truth of its transformation would not be buried by rumor. She also began the process of training a new generation of Targaryen knights and ladies who served as mediators between Westeros and Valyria, bridging the cultural gap that once seemed unbridgeable. In quiet moments, she would walk through the city's older quarters, remembering how she first arrived by ship, seeing only a few spires in the choking fog. Now, it was a thriving place of color, innovation, and vigilant guardianship. On one such walk, late in the evening, she visited a high terrace where the keepers had placed shrines to honor the city's draconic heritage. The sky was a tapestry of fiery orange as the sun sank behind the smoke-laden horizon. Corrigan rested near the edge, tail sweeping lazily. Rayella stood before a carved monolith etched with ancient Valyrian script, her eyes scanning the runes. She recalled the days of her youth, when all knowledge of Valyria seemed locked behind centuries of fear and myth. The monolith served as a memorial to those who died in the Doom, as well as a testament that new life could rise. She bowed her head in silent prayer, whether to the Seven, the old Valyrian gods, or simply to the memory of those lost, she could not say. Footsteps approached. Naris Valar, who was now among the eldest of the keepers, stood quietly beside her. The lines on Naira's face spoke of age and care, yet her posture remained regal. They exchanged a few words about the city's progress. Then Naris observed, voice soft, "It has been more than 2 decades since you first set foot here, Rayella Targaryen. In that time you have done more to honor the spirit of the Freehold, its best aspects, than anyone since before the Doom. One wonders if you too might be remembered as a dreamer." "Nah, Rayella gave a wry smile. "I have no gift for prophecy, only a stubborn hope that we can forge something better than the empire that once enslaved half the world. Perhaps that is dream enough." Naris inclined her head. "Dream enough, indeed, and perhaps it is why the dragons answered your call. They sensed the sincerity in your blood." They watched the embers of sunset fade, each woman lost in thought. Though the road ahead would never be free of threat, reborn Valyria had proven its mettle. It had faced a savage cult, arcane nightmares, and the suspicion of a world that remembered the old empire's tyranny. Yet it remained standing, forging alliances through cooperation rather than fear. The clang of hammers on anvils echoed from below, where smiths continued to shape new wonders from Valyrian steel. Dragonriders soared on the horizon, performing evening sweeps. The city was more alive than any could have believed on the day of the Targaryen fleet's arrival. In time, the chronicle of "What if old Valyria returned as a haven for Dragonriders" became a tale recited by poets across the realms. Bards sang of the Targaryen queen who joined forces with hidden keepers to reawaken the city of dragons not as a monstrous conqueror, but as a vigilant sentinel against deeper evils. Histories recorded how a lineage once hounded by the ghosts of the Doom found a measure of redemption. Children in Westeros and Essos alike grew up hearing that dragons, while fearsome, could also be guardians of knowledge and life, provided their riders had hearts guided by empathy rather than hubris. Whether these stories were told with perfect accuracy or embroidered by the passage of years, the kernel of truth endured. And so the cycles of life continued. Danis eventually stepped into a leadership role within the Order of the Embers, commanding respect from men twice her age. Rhaegar refined the wards, discovered new ways of stabilizing the region's geology, and taught advanced illusions that helped deter would-be raiders. The city's population gradually grew to rival some of the smaller free cities. Displaced peoples found a home in its basalt streets, forging a diverse, if occasionally fractious, community. Lords in Westeros might bicker about how far the Queen's attention strayed, but none could deny that the realm as a whole was safer from external threats with reborn Valyria standing watch. When Rhaella at last grew old, her silver hair turned white, her face lined with both joy and sorrow. Yet her spirit stayed unbroken. She could still mount Corrigan and fly, though she left the more strenuous journeys to her children. She knew she had done what once seemed impossible, woven together the threads of two worlds. In her final years, she often stayed in Valyria, walking with a cane through the city's courtyards, greeting hatchlings in the breeding pens, or simply gazing at the smoking sea with a wistful smile. Sometimes she found herself humming lullabies in High Valyrian, old songs that seemed to float into her mind from a distant collective memory. She never fully understood them, but she felt in those moments connected to the entire tapestry of Valyria's past, present, and future. When she passed on, it was said that Corrigan roared for 3 nights, a lament that echoed through every spire. The city draped itself in black and red banners, while King's Landing did the same, mourning the sovereign who bridged the realms. Daenerys and Rhaegar oversaw her funeral pyre by the sea, a mixture of Westerosi custom and Valyrian tradition. The flames danced high, carrying her spirit into the skies she had loved. In that solemn glow, the watchers saw shapes of dragons in the smoke, perhaps mere illusions of shadow and fire, or perhaps a final farewell from the old gods of Valyria. Yet the city did not die with her. It lived on, guided by the next generation of Dragonriders, anchored in the treaties and friendships she had forged. Reborn Valyria maintained its stance as a haven, opening its gates to seekers of knowledge and those who sought refuge from the darker corners of the world. Over time, even the most stubborn lords in Westeros came to accept that Valyria's new flame did not threaten them, so long as they did not raise swords in envy or fear. The city's forging techniques spread, albeit sparingly, helping create tools that advanced agriculture and medicine. Dragons nested in high basalt perches, their roars marking the changing of day to night, symbols now of vigilant guardianship rather than unstoppable conquest. Generations hence, the legend of how old Valyria had returned in peace grew so strong that it almost overshadowed the horrors that once defined it. Children from every corner of the known world heard tales of the Targaryen queen who arrived with humility and left behind a thriving civilization. They heard of her children, Daenerys the warrior and Rhaegar the scholar, each embodying a fragment of Valyria's resurrected soul. They learned how the city overcame a fanatical cult bent on igniting a second doom. They admired how dragons, once the terror of armies, now soared above the spires in mutual trust with their riders. And in the end, that legacy, the healing of old wounds, the forging of new alliances, and the unwavering commitment to safeguard knowledge and life, became the guiding star of reborn Valyria. No subtitles marked its chapters, no single banner claimed its spires. It was a place woven from many threads, where the blood of the dragon pulsed side by side with the beating hearts of countless souls who found hope along the smoking sea. It stood as proof that even from the ashes of cataclysm, a more luminous dawn could rise, if only people and dragons had the courage to shape it.